The story of the Roman Legionnaires begins not with the professional armies of the empire, but in the earlier centuries when Rome was nothing more than a collection of villages along the banks of the Tiber River. Warfare was a constant fact of life for the people of Latium, and survival demanded that every able-bodied man know how to fight. In this environment, the earliest Roman conception of the soldier emerged, not as a professional warrior, but as a citizen whose obligation to the community included answering the call to arms whenever danger threatened. Military duty was not separate from civic duty. The two were identical. To be Roman was to be ready to serve in defence of the city, to shed blood for it if necessary, and to accept that the stability of the household and the prosperity of the farm depended upon the collective ability of the community to resist its neighbours, and, when opportunity permitted, to subdue them. This earliest tradition was strongly influenced by Rome's neighbours. The Etruscans to the north possessed more developed city-states and armies that often relied on the hoplite phalanx, a formation perfected by the Greeks and adopted widely throughout the Mediterranean. Rome's initial kings, some of them of Etruscan origin, absorbed these influences. The phalanx, with its wall of shields and projecting spears, required discipline, training, and above all cooperation. No man in the formation could stand alone. Survival depended on the shield of one's neighbour. For the Romans, this perfectly matched their communal ethos, where the strength of the group outweighed the individual. Archaeological evidence suggests that Rome's aristocracy, the wealthy landowners who could afford armour and weapons, formed the core of this early army, while poorer citizens supported them with lighter equipment or served as skirmishers. Tradition places major reforms of this system under the sixth king of Rome, Servius Tullius, sometime in the 6th century BCE. Although the historical accuracy of these accounts is debated, the reforms attributed to him reveal much about how the Romans thought their early military organisation developed. Citizens were classified according to wealth, with the richest expected to supply themselves with the best equipment: helmet, cuirass, greaves, shield, and spear. Those of lesser means provided lighter arms, while the poorest, having nothing at all, served as unarmed assistants or were excluded from the battle line. This classification created what was called the centuriate system, where men were grouped into centuries, units that became the foundation not only of the army, but of the political assemblies. In this way, Rome linked the right to vote directly to the obligation to fight, making the soldier and the citizen inseparable identities. The centuriate structure reveals the deeply pragmatic nature of Roman society. War was too frequent and too essential for survival to allow idealism to override practicality. The city needed every man it could muster, but it also demanded that service match one's capacity. Wealthier men provided more protection, and heavier arms, standing in the front lines where battle was thickest. Men of moderate means filled the ranks behind them, while those with little contributed in auxiliary roles. This arrangement reinforced the social hierarchy, while simultaneously making clear that all shared responsibility for defence. Military service was thus not merely a duty but also a form of social expression, a way to show one's place within the community and one's value to the state. The earliest Roman armies fought mostly local wars. Neighbouring Latin towns, Volscians, Equi and Sabines contested territory constantly. Each generation grew up in the expectation that fighting would be part of life. These small-scale wars were brutal but limited, often seasonal, and usually settled by quick raids or skirmishes. A Roman man would till his fields in spring, take up arms in summer, and return to his farm after the campaign ended. The economy and the military were thus interwoven. There was no standing army, no professional corps, and no permanent garrisons. The soldiers of Rome were its citizens, and when war ended they resumed their place in civilian life. Over time, however, the Romans realised that the rigid phalanx formation they had adopted from the Greeks was not always suited to the varied terrain of Italy. The rolling hills, forests and valleys of the peninsula made it difficult to manoeuvre dense blocks of men armed with long spears. Rome's frequent wars against the Samnites in the central highlands highlighted these weaknesses. The Samnites fought in looser, more flexible formations, exploiting the terrain with ambushes and sudden strikes. Roman soldiers, facing defeats and hardships, adapted. They began experimenting with smaller units that could move independently while still fighting together when needed. Out of this process emerged the manipular system, the forerunner of the classic Roman legion, which gave the Romans the tactical adaptability that would later make them dominant across continents. In the manipular system, the Roman battle line was divided into 3 layers based on age and experience. At the front stood the hastati, young men eager for glory, armed with the distinctive Roman shield, the scutum, and short sword, the gladius. Behind them were the principes, men in their prime, steadier and more experienced. At the rear stood the triarii, hardened veterans whose presence reassured the rest of the army that seasoned hands were ready to stabilise the line if disaster threatened. This tripartite formation embodied the Roman way of thinking. Youth carried the initial shock, maturity bore the sustained fight, and age held the final reserve. The proverb, "It has come to the triarii," entered Roman speech to describe a desperate situation when only the veterans could save the day. The manipular legion was more than a battlefield formation. It was an extension of Roman social organisation. Service was tied to age, class, and civic identity. Soldiers trained not as isolated warriors, but as members of a unit whose honour and shame were collective. Cowardice could doom an entire maniple, and discipline was enforced with a severity that astonished outsiders. Commanders were empowered to execute deserters or those who broke formation. Entire units might suffer decimation, where 1 man in 10 was chosen by lot to be beaten to death by his comrades, a punishment designed to terrify and to reinforce the absolute importance of unity. Such harshness did not break the Romans, but hardened them. Over generations, it instilled an ethos of discipline that became legendary. Religion also shaped this martial identity. War was never declared or conducted without rituals designed to secure divine favour. The official priests performed ceremonies to declare just war, hurling a spear into enemy territory to signal the beginning of hostilities. Before battle, generals conducted sacrifices and omens were carefully observed. Soldiers swore sacred oaths, the sacramentum binding themselves to obey their commanders and to fight for Rome. To break the oath was not merely to disobey, but to offend the gods. In this way, religion and warfare reinforced one another, ensuring that the army's cohesion was both civic and sacred. By the 4th century BCE, the Roman military tradition had already distinguished itself from that of many neighbours. Where others fought as bands of warriors or mercenaries, Rome fielded organised citizen armies bound by oath, discipline, and social duty. This gave the Romans a resilience that shocked their enemies. They could lose battles yet raise new armies year after year, as every citizen was tied to the defence of the state. Even catastrophic defeats, such as those suffered against the Gauls or Samnites, could not destroy Rome because the system itself ensured endless renewal. Every farm was a recruitment base, every household a potential contributor to the war effort. The Punic Wars against Carthage in the 3rd century BCE would push this tradition to its limits. The manipular legion, hardened in countless Italian wars, would now confront a global rival with immense resources, powerful fleets, and generals like Hannibal, whose genius challenged everything the Romans thought they knew about war. But long before those struggles, the identity of the Roman soldier was already forged. Service was life, duty was unquestioned, and the collective survival of the city outweighed any individual cost. This was the origin of the tradition that would eventually give birth to the professional legionnaire, the symbol of Roman power for centuries to come. The birth of the Roman legion as a distinct military institution cannot be understood without appreciating the conditions that forced Rome to abandon older methods of fighting and replace them with formations uniquely suited to its geography, politics, and ambitions. In the centuries when the city-state was still consolidating power within Latium, its armies had resembled those of other Italic peoples, a mixture of citizen soldiers fighting in phalanxes that derived ultimately from Greek influence. These formations, though effective under certain conditions, proved increasingly inadequate, as Rome expanded into territories where steep hills, broken ground, and heavily forested landscapes rendered the rigid blocks of the phalanx both unwieldy and dangerous. It was in the crucible of these wars, particularly the long and grueling Samnite conflicts, that the legion, as we recognise it, began to take form. The wars with the Samnites were unlike the set-piece battles the phalanx had been designed to fight. The Samnites occupied the Apennine highlands and fought in loose formations well adapted to the rugged terrain. They struck suddenly from ambush, retreated into the hills, and forced the Romans to chase them through terrain where a dense block of spearmen was little more than a liability. Roman defeats in these wars demonstrated that clinging to the phalanx would only guarantee continued frustration. Adaptation was necessary, and out of this necessity arose the manipular legion, the earliest expression of the true Roman legionary system. The manipular system divided the army into smaller tactical units called maniples. Each maniple consisted of roughly 120 men, though the number could vary, and two maniples together formed a cohort in the later terminology that would dominate imperial times. This division into smaller units allowed Roman soldiers to maneuver with far greater flexibility than the phalanx permitted. Instead of one unbroken wall of shields, the manipular legion deployed in a checkerboard pattern, with gaps between maniples that enabled rapid movement and reorganisation during battle. This tactical innovation allowed Roman commanders to exploit weaknesses in the enemy line, reinforce threatened sections, or envelop exposed flanks with a degree of control unknown in the older formation. The manipular legion was not merely a tactical arrangement, but also a reflection of Roman social structure and military experience. The first line of the formation was composed of the hastati, the youngest men, typically in their late teens or early 20s, who had the vigour but not yet the experience of older soldiers. Armed with the scutum, a large curved rectangular shield, a gladius, and the pilum, a heavy javelin designed to bend on impact and render enemy shields useless. The stati were tasked with delivering the initial shock of combat. Their role was dangerous, but it provided the training ground where youths learned the art of war. Behind them stood the princeps, men in their late 20s and 30s, hardened by years of service and possessing both strength and steadiness. They bore similar equipment, but their experience allowed them to sustain the fight after the initial clash. They represented the backbone of the line, ready to press the advantage if the hastati faltered or if the enemy showed weakness. At the rear were the triarii, veterans with many campaigns behind them. Their equipment often included long spears, and their role was to act as the final reserve. They knelt behind the front ranks, rising only if the situation became desperate. The Roman saying, "It has come to the triarii," captured the moment when the battle reached its most critical stage, for if the triarii were committed, all other options had been exhausted. Supporting these heavy infantry were the velites, light-armed skirmishers drawn from the poorer citizens. They carried small round shields, light javelins and short swords, and their role was to harass the enemy with missile fire, disrupt formations, and cover the advance of the heavier infantry. Although less prestigious than the heavy infantry, the velites played a crucial role in preparing the battlefield for the decisive clash. Alongside them operated the cavalry, known as equites, drawn from the wealthier classes who could afford horses and the equipment necessary for mounted service. While never as dominant as cavalry forces in other cultures, the Roman horsemen provided reconnaissance, flanking support, and pursuit of routed enemies. The manipular legion thus combined different types of soldiers into a flexible system that could respond to varied challenges. Its organisation reflected Roman pragmatism, always more concerned with what worked in practice than with maintaining inherited tradition. Every element had its place, and every citizen had a role, determined by age, wealth, and experience. This created not just a military machine, but a social order in arms, one that mirrored the Republic's broader political structure, where classes and generations were bound together in common service. Training for the legionary system was rigorous. Soldiers practiced marching in formation for long distances, often carrying full equipment to build endurance. They drilled with weighted wooden swords heavier than their real weapons to strengthen their arms, and ensure that when combat came their movements would be swift and sure. Throwing the pilum was practiced repeatedly, as this weapon was central to Roman tactics. A volley of pila could shatter an enemy line before the clash of swords even began, the iron shank of the javelin bending upon impact to render enemy shields useless, and littering the battlefield with obstacles that made movement difficult. This combination of disciplined missile use followed by close combat with the gladius gave the Roman soldier a deadly efficiency unmatched by many of their adversaries. The rise of the Manipular Legion coincided with the expansion of Roman political control over Italy. As the Republic conquered neighbouring peoples, it bound them into alliances that required military service. These soci provided allied contingents that supplemented Roman forces, effectively doubling the manpower available for campaigns. The Roman citizen legions fought alongside allied wings, often deployed on the flanks of the line, creating armies of enormous size and diversity. This integration of allies was one of Rome's greatest strengths, for it allowed the state to field armies year after year, even after suffering severe losses. The system of alliances also spread Roman military practices across Italy, gradually homogenizing the peninsula under a common style of warfare. One of the earliest great tests of the Manipular Legion came in the wars against Pyrrhus of Epirus in the early 3rd century BCE. Pyrrhus, a Greek king and cousin of Alexander the Great, brought with him the formidable phalanx formation perfected by Macedonian armies. Facing such a force, the Romans had to prove whether their manipular flexibility could withstand the crushing weight of a professional phalanx supported by war elephants. Although Pyrrhus won costly victories at Heraclea and Asculum, the Roman system demonstrated its resilience. Each defeat was temporary, for Rome could raise new armies and return to the field. The Manipular Legion endured, and Pyrrhus himself admitted that fighting the Romans was like battling the Hydra. Cut off one head, and more would rise in its place. In the long run, his costly victories achieved nothing, while Rome's military system emerged stronger than ever. This resilience was the true genius of the legionary system. It was not invincible in any single battle, but it was nearly impossible to destroy in the long term. The citizen-soldier tradition meant that losses, however severe, could be replenished, while the discipline and training of the legion meant that even new recruits quickly absorbed the ethos of endurance. Unlike mercenary armies, which dissolved when pay was scarce, or aristocratic retinues, which fought only for their leaders' ambitions, the Roman legion fought for the survival and honour of the Republic itself. Defeat, therefore, was never final, and enemies soon learned that Rome always returned to the field. The organisation of the legion was supported by a strict hierarchy of officers. At the top stood the consul or praetor commanding the army, magistrates elected by the people with both political and military authority. Under them were the legates, senior officers appointed to command sections of the army. Each legion was divided into cohorts and centuries, commanded by centurions who were the backbone of discipline. Centurions rose from the ranks, chosen for their courage, reliability, and ability to enforce order. Their authority over their men was absolute, and their role ensured that discipline was maintained even under the most trying conditions. The centurion's vine staff, a symbol of his office, was used both as a badge of rank and as an instrument of punishment, a reminder that Roman discipline was enforced by constant vigilance. The culture of the legion was deeply intertwined with Roman ideas of honour, duty, and sacrifice. Soldiers swore the sacramentum, a sacred oath to obey orders and never abandon their comrades. This oath bound them not only to their commanders but to the gods, making disobedience both a crime and a sacrilege. The sense of collective responsibility was so strong that soldiers would endure almost any hardship rather than bring shame upon their unit. This ethos made the legion more than a military formation. It was a brotherhood bound by law, religion, and honour. As Rome expanded its horizons beyond Italy, the Manipular Legion proved its worth in larger conflicts, particularly during the Punic Wars against Carthage. Facing Hannibal and his veteran army of mercenaries, cavalry, and war elephants, the Romans suffered catastrophic defeats, most famously at Cannae in 216 BCE. Yet even this disaster, where tens of thousands of Romans were killed in a single day, did not break the system. New legions were raised, allies remained bound by treaty, and the Republic endured. Over the long struggle, the discipline and adaptability of the legion allowed Rome to recover, to learn from defeat, and ultimately to emerge victorious. The birth of the legion and its first formations thus represent not merely a military innovation, but the crystallization of a uniquely Roman approach to war. It was pragmatic, adaptable, and resilient, designed not only to win battles but to survive defeats. It reflected the social order of the Republic, where duty to the state outweighed individual preference, and where every citizen understood that his life and fortune were tied to the survival of Rome. The Manipular Legion was the seed from which the professional imperial army would later grow, and its endurance through the Republic's greatest trials laid the foundation for centuries of dominance. The period of the Republic saw the legionary system become inseparable from the political and social fabric of Rome. Every campaign, every levy of troops, and every battlefield triumph or disaster was tied to the idea that the Roman soldier was first and foremost a citizen, and that his service was both a duty and a privilege. In this system, the army was not a professional institution, existing apart from society, but rather an extension of the Republic's civic body. Service in arms and service in politics were two sides of the same coin, and the fate of the Republic rested on the ability of its citizens to fight, to endure, and to sustain the state through continual warfare. The citizen-soldier ideal had its foundation in the conviction that political rights must be accompanied by obligations. The assemblies that elected magistrates and voted on laws were the same assemblies that decided questions of war and peace, and those who voted were also those who would march into battle when war was declared. The Centuria Assembly, organised by wealth into centuries, gave greater voting weight to those who could afford heavy arms and who stood in the front ranks of the army. This structure reinforced the intimate link between military service and civic authority. To have a voice in Rome's destiny was to have a place in its battle line. The economic base of this system lay in the small farms of central Italy. Roman citizens were expected to own land, and it was from this property-owning class that the legions were drawn. The farm provided both the sustenance for the family and the resources to equip the soldier. When a campaign was called, the farmer laid down his plough, took up his shield and sword, and marched with his fellow citizens to defend or expand the Republic. When the fighting was done, he returned to his fields. This cycle of farming and soldiering created a rhythm of life that defined the Republic for centuries. It also meant that Rome's wars were seasonal, with campaigns often beginning in spring and concluding before the harvest. Because military service was tied to property, the ideal of the citizen soldier was bound up with the preservation of the Republic's agrarian base. To be a citizen was to contribute both in peace and in war. The loss of one's land meant not only economic ruin but exclusion from military service, and by extension, from political participation. This reality gave military service an intensely personal dimension. Men were fighting not only for Rome, but for the preservation of their status as citizens. Defeat or dishonour could mean the loss of property and freedom, while victory reinforced their standing within the Republic. The conduct of campaigns during the Republican era illustrates the centrality of this citizen-soldier ethos. Armies were raised annually through the levy, in which consuls or praetors summoned citizens to appear for selection. The levy was not voluntary in the modern sense, but was rather a duty enforced by law. Failure to appear could result in fines or even enslavement. Once assembled, men were sorted into maniples based on age and equipment. The young were placed in the hastati, the more seasoned in the principes, and veterans in the triarii. The poorest served as velites, while the wealthiest could be called upon to provide cavalry. This annual renewal of armies reinforced the idea that service was a civic obligation, not a profession. Discipline was severe, for without it a citizen army could easily dissolve into disorder. Roman commanders had near absolute authority over their soldiers, backed by law and tradition. Punishments for desertion or cowardice were brutal. Decimation, where every 10th man in a disgraced unit was executed by his comrades, instilled a terror of dishonour. Flogging, fines, and forced labour were common punishments for lesser infractions. Yet the harshness of Roman discipline was accepted because it was rooted in the shared understanding that the survival of the Republic depended on obedience. The soldier was bound by the sacramentum, the sacred oath of loyalty, and this made his duty not only a civic matter, but a religious one. To break faith with the army was to break faith with the gods. The rewards of service were not measured solely in pay, which in the early Republic was minimal, but in honour and prestige. Victories were celebrated with triumphs in which generals paraded through Rome with their troops, displaying spoils and captives. The soldier who marched in such a procession shared in the glory of Rome and could boast of his participation in great deeds. The memory of service was treasured, passed down through families and inscribed on tombstones. To have fought for the Republic was a mark of distinction, proof that one had fulfilled the highest obligation of citizenship. The constant warfare of the Republic tested this ideal to its limits. Rome fought not occasional wars but almost unbroken campaigns year after year, expanding across Italy, into Sicily, Spain, and beyond. The demand for soldiers was unrelenting, and the burden on the citizen body immense. Farms were often neglected while men were away, leading to hardship for families left behind. The wealthy could sometimes afford to hire labourers to maintain their estates, but poorer farmers often returned to find their lands ruined or seized by creditors. This strain exposed the vulnerabilities of the citizen-soldier model, even as it forged the resilience that made Rome so formidable. One of the most remarkable features of this system was Rome's capacity to recover from defeats that would have destroyed other states. In 390 BCE, when the Gauls sacked Rome, the city rebuilt and resumed its wars within a few years. During the Samnite Wars, repeated setbacks did not end Roman resistance but hardened it. The most striking example came in the Second Punic War, when Hannibal inflicted catastrophic defeats at Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and most famously at Cannae, where tens of thousands of Romans were killed in a single day. Any other state might have sued for peace, but the citizen-soldier ethos ensured that Rome fought on. New levies were raised, boys and old men were conscripted, and allies were compelled to provide additional troops. The Republic endured because its citizens accepted that their survival depended on unyielding service. The political consequences of this system were profound. Military service gave citizens a stake in the Republic's decisions. Men who fought and bled for Rome expected a voice in its governance. The assemblies reflected this, with voting power tied to centuries based on military class. The Senate, composed of former magistrates, was filled with men who had proven themselves in war. Even the highest office, the consulship, was defined by military command. To lead Rome politically was to lead her armies in the field. There was no distinction between statesman and general. Every leader was both. This fusion of politics and war gave the Republic a unity of purpose that few other states could match. Yet the very success of this system contained the seeds of strain. The expansion of Rome beyond Italy required longer campaigns, sometimes lasting years and fought in distant provinces. The seasonal rhythm of farming and soldiering broke down as men were kept away from their fields for extended periods. The burden fell hardest on small farmers, whose lands could not survive repeated absences. Over time, many were forced to sell their property and migrate to the city, swelling the ranks of the poor. The citizen-soldier ideal, once rooted firmly in the agrarian base of the Republic, began to erode as economic realities shifted. Despite these challenges, the ethos of the citizen soldier remained deeply embedded in Roman identity. Roman writers praised the virtues of the farmer soldier, extolling the simplicity, discipline, and patriotism of those who tilled the land and fought for the Republic. This image became a central part of Rome's self-conception, even as the realities of warfare grew more complex. The ideal soldier was not a mercenary fighting for pay, but a citizen defending his community. This distinction set Rome apart from many of its rivals, and gave its armies a moral cohesion that others often lacked. Religion continued to reinforce this ethos. Before battle, auguries were taken to seek the favour of the gods, sacrifices were made, and the standards of the legions were consecrated. Victory was attributed not only to the skill and courage of the soldiers, but to the favour of Jupiter, Mars, and other deities. The rituals of war bound the army together in shared belief, reminding each soldier that he fought under divine protection and that his duty was sanctified by higher powers. This gave Roman armies a psychological strength that sustained them in adversity. The citizen-soldier model also influenced Rome's treatment of its allies. Conquered communities were often required to provide troops in proportion to their population, creating a vast network of Italian peoples bound into Rome's wars. These allies fought alongside Roman citizens, sharing in both the burdens and the spoils. Although they did not initially enjoy the full rights of citizenship, their integration into the military system laid the groundwork for the eventual extension of citizenship across Italy. In this way, the citizen-soldier ideal expanded, gradually encompassing a broader population and reinforcing the Republic's dominance. By the late Republic, however, the strains of continuous warfare and social change were beginning to transform the nature of the Roman army. Wealth inequalities grew, small farms disappeared, and increasing numbers of citizens found themselves without the property qualifications required for service. The Republic faced a dilemma. It needed more soldiers than ever, yet its traditional base was shrinking. The reforms of Gaius Marius in the late 2nd century BCE would address this crisis by opening the legions to the landless poor and professionalizing the army. But before those reforms, the citizen-soldier ideal remained the foundation upon which the Republic had risen to supremacy. This ideal, with its blend of civic obligation, agrarian virtue, religious sanction, and military discipline, created the Roman character that astonished both allies and enemies. It explained how Rome could endure defeats that would have shattered other states, how it could wage wars across generations, and how it could bind diverse peoples into a single system of duty and reward. The citizen soldier was not merely a fighter. He was the embodiment of the Republic itself, carrying its values into every battle and ensuring that Rome's destiny was forged not in the ambitions of kings, but in the collective service of its citizens. The Punic Wars were the greatest crucible of the Roman Republic, a century-long struggle against Carthage that tested not only the courage of individual soldiers, but the resilience of the entire system of the legionary citizen soldier. Carthage, a wealthy maritime empire founded by Phoenician settlers in North Africa, controlled vast territories in Spain, North Africa, Sicily, and the western Mediterranean. Its fleets dominated the sea, and its armies, composed of mercenaries, allied troops, and elite commanders, were feared across the region. Rome, having secured dominance over Italy, was drawn into conflict with Carthage over Sicily, the strategically vital island that served as the gateway between the eastern and western Mediterranean. The wars that followed would span generations, devastate entire populations, and reshape the destiny of Rome, while testing the limits of the legionary system in ways no enemy had ever done before. The First Punic War, fought from 264 to 241 BCE, introduced Rome to large-scale warfare beyond the Italian peninsula. The conflict began when Roman forces intervened in a dispute in Messana, a city in northeastern Sicily. What started as a local quarrel escalated into a confrontation between Rome and Carthage, each unwilling to cede influence over the island. Rome had little naval experience at the start, while Carthage was the greatest maritime power of the time. To challenge Carthage at sea, Rome undertook the extraordinary task of building a fleet from scratch. Legend holds that they copied the design of a captured Carthaginian quinquereme, constructing hundreds of warships in a matter of months. To compensate for their inexperience, the Romans devised the corvus, a boarding device with a spike that allowed legionaries to storm enemy vessels as if they were fighting on land. This adaptation turned sea battles into infantry engagements, playing to Rome's strengths and allowing its soldiers to impose their discipline even on the water. The First Punic War dragged on for over 2 decades, marked by immense losses on both sides. Rome suffered repeated naval disasters, losing fleets to storms as well as to Carthaginian skill. But the Roman capacity for resilience was already evident. Each time fleets were lost, new ones were built, often funded by extraordinary contributions from citizens. On land, Roman legions fought prolonged campaigns in Sicily, enduring sieges, starvation and disease. At length, Rome's persistence wore Carthage down. The decisive Roman naval victory at the Battle of the Aegates Islands forced Carthage to sue for peace. Sicily became Rome's first province, and the Republic emerged as a Mediterranean power, its citizen soldiers having proven that their endurance could overcome even the most experienced adversary. The peace was short-lived. Carthage rebuilt its strength, expanding its influence in Spain under the leadership of the Barcid family, whose most famous member, Hannibal, would become Rome's greatest enemy. The Second Punic War, beginning in 218 BCE, would be the ultimate test of the legionary system. Hannibal's audacity in leading his army, complete with war elephants, across the Alps into Italy stunned the ancient world. His arrival ignited a series of battles in which Roman legions suffered some of the worst defeats in their history. At the Trebia River, Hannibal lured a Roman army into a trap, enveloping it with cavalry and ambush forces. At Lake Trasimene, he orchestrated one of the largest ambushes ever recorded, slaughtering tens of thousands of Romans caught between the lake and his hidden troops. The most catastrophic blow came at Cannae in 216 BCE, where Hannibal employed a double envelopment maneuver that destroyed a Roman army of nearly 80,000 men. The carnage was unprecedented. Tens of thousands were killed, including many senators and members of the Roman elite. No other state in the Mediterranean could have endured such a disaster, but Rome, though shaken, refused to yield. The citizen-soldier ethos was the key to this resilience. Even after Cannae, when many allies defected to Hannibal, and panic gripped the Republic, the Romans levied new armies, conscripting boys barely of age and even slaves in desperate numbers. Wealthy citizens contributed funds, and the Senate, refusing to negotiate with Hannibal, projected an image of defiance that inspired its people. The discipline of the legions was reorganized under the Fabian strategy, named for the dictator Quintus Fabius Maximus, who avoided direct confrontation and harassed Hannibal through attrition. Though unpopular at first, this cautious approach preserved Roman manpower and gradually eroded Hannibal's momentum. The war revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the legionary system. On one hand, Roman adaptability and resilience enabled the Republic to recover from defeats that would have destroyed other states. On the other, the citizen-soldier model placed enormous strain on the population. Continuous levies drained manpower, disrupted agriculture, and impoverished many families. Farms were abandoned as soldiers served for years on end, creating long-term economic consequences. Yet despite the burden, the willingness of citizens to fight year after year gave Rome a strategic depth that Hannibal could not match. Eventually, Rome shifted the war to Carthage's holdings in Spain and Africa. Under leaders like Publius Cornelius Scipio, later called Africanus, Roman legions adapted to new styles of warfare. Scipio trained his men to counter Carthaginian cavalry and elephants, employed more flexible tactics, and forged alliances with local peoples. His campaigns in Spain deprived Hannibal of reinforcements, while his eventual invasion of Africa forced Carthage to recall its general. At the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, Scipio's legions decisively defeated Hannibal, using disciplined manipular formations to neutralize war elephants and outmaneuver Carthaginian troops. With Carthage's defeat, Rome emerged as the unrivaled power in the Western Mediterranean. The Second Punic War left an indelible mark on the legionnaire tradition. It had demonstrated that Roman armies could endure catastrophic losses and still recover, that the resilience of the citizen body was unmatched, and that the discipline of the legions could adapt even against the most brilliant of opponents. But it also exposed the weaknesses of the system. The prolonged strain on the small farmer-soldier base contributed to growing economic inequality, as wealthy elites consolidated land into large estates worked by slaves while poorer citizens, ruined by long absences at war, migrated to the cities. This shift eroded the agrarian foundation of the citizen-soldier model, setting the stage for future reforms. The Third Punic War, fought from 149 to 146 BCE, was shorter but no less significant in testing the legionnaires. Carthage, though weakened and bound by treaty, recovered economically and resisted Roman interference in its affairs. Rome, determined to eliminate its old rival, launched a campaign to destroy the city itself. The siege of Carthage lasted 3 years, during which Roman soldiers endured fierce resistance. The defenders fought with desperation, and the urban warfare tested Roman adaptability in new ways. Eventually the city was stormed, its inhabitants slaughtered or enslaved, and its walls levelled. The destruction of Carthage ended the Punic threat forever, and symbolised the ruthless determination of Rome's citizen soldiers to annihilate any enemy who challenged their republic. Beyond the battlefield, the Punic Wars transformed the very nature of Roman warfare. The experience of prolonged overseas campaigns changed the expectations of soldiers. No longer were wars confined to seasonal expeditions within Italy. They became years-long struggles fought in distant provinces. The rewards of conquest included immense wealth, plunder, and opportunities for personal advancement. Legionnaires returned not only with scars, but with stories of foreign lands, foreign peoples, and spoils that reshaped the economy and culture of Rome. The influx of wealth, however, deepened social divisions, for while generals and elites enriched themselves, many common soldiers returned to ruined farms and poverty. The wars also reshaped Roman command structures. The need for experienced generals to lead long campaigns enhanced the prestige of military leaders. Figures like Scipio Africanus gained immense popularity, and their authority sometimes rivaled that of the Senate itself. The loyalty of soldiers to charismatic commanders foreshadowed the later crises of the Republic, when generals would use their armies as instruments of political power. The Punic Wars thus not only tested the resilience of the legionary system, but also planted the seeds of its transformation. For the legionnaires themselves, the Punic Wars were a proving ground unlike any other. They faced enemies with vastly different strengths: mercenaries from across the Mediterranean, war elephants, elite cavalry, and brilliant commanders. They endured defeats on a scale rarely seen in antiquity, yet they also experienced triumphs that reshaped the known world. Their endurance demonstrated the unique qualities of the Roman military tradition: adaptability, discipline, and an almost inexhaustible will to continue fighting. The Punic Wars revealed the true nature of the Roman citizen soldier, not as an invincible warrior, but as part of a system so resilient that no single defeat, however terrible, could break it. The legacy of these wars extended far beyond the immediate victories. Rome emerged as the dominant power in the Mediterranean, with provinces in Spain, Africa, and the islands. The legionnaires who had fought in Sicily, Spain, Italy, and Africa had carried Rome from a regional power to an imperial state. Their sacrifices laid the foundation for centuries of expansion, but the wars also revealed the cracks in the system, the growing strain on the agrarian citizen base, and the increasing role of wealth and power in shaping military service. These tensions would define the next phase of Roman history, as reforms and civil strife reshaped the legionary identity once more. The Punic Wars had made Rome the master of the Western Mediterranean, but the triumph carried within it profound tensions that began to undermine the citizen-soldier system on which the Republic had been built. For centuries, military service had been tied to land ownership, and the legionary had been imagined as a farmer who laid down his tools to fight in defence of his city, and then returned to his fields once the campaign was done. That model had sustained Rome through countless wars, but by the late 2nd century BCE, it was showing signs of collapse. The length and distance of campaigns kept men away from their farms for years at a time. Many returned to find their land ruined, seized by creditors, or swallowed up by the estates of the wealthy. The economic base of the traditional citizen soldier was eroding, and the Republic faced a crisis of manpower just as its military commitments were expanding across the Mediterranean. Into this environment stepped Gaius Marius, a man from Arpinum, a town outside Rome, whose career would reshape the Roman army and permanently alter the relationship between soldiers, commanders, and the state. Marius had risen through the ranks by merit, not by aristocratic birth, and his reputation as a skilled soldier and strict disciplinarian earned him the consulship in 107 BCE during a period of intense military need. Rome was embroiled in wars in North Africa against Jugurtha, the king of Numidia, and the Republic needed capable leadership. Marius, elected on a platform of military reform and popular support, set in motion changes that would transform the legionary from a property-owning citizen to a professional soldier whose livelihood depended on the state and whose loyalty increasingly centred on his general. The first and most significant of Marius's reforms was the abolition of the property qualification for military service. Previously, only those who owned land above a certain value could serve as heavy infantry. By removing this requirement, Marius opened the legions to the capit censi, the head count, the poorest citizens who had little or no property. These men had previously been excluded from the manipular legions, relegated to light-armed roles or no military service at all. Now, under Marius, they became the backbone of the army. The state provided arms, armour and training, equipping men who could never have afforded the heavy gear required for service. In one stroke, Marius vastly expanded the pool of recruits, solving the manpower crisis, but he also fundamentally altered the social character of the legions. The shift from property-owning citizen to professional soldier had profound consequences. Service was no longer an occasional duty tied to land, but a full-time occupation that could last for years, even decades. Soldiers of the Marian legions did not simply return to farms after a campaign. For many, the army became their livelihood, their only source of stability. The promise of land grants at the end of service became a crucial incentive, and here lay the seeds of a new problem. The Senate was often reluctant to fulfill such promises, and soldiers began to look to their generals, not the state, to secure their rewards. The personal bond between commander and soldier grew stronger, eroding the traditional loyalty to the Republic as an institution. Marius also reorganized the structure of the legions themselves. The manipular system, with its 3 lines of hastati, principes and triarii, was replaced by the cohort as the basic tactical unit. Each legion was divided into 10 cohorts, each containing about 480 men, further subdivided into 6 centuries commanded by centurions. This simplification increased flexibility and standardization, allowing commanders to deploy their forces more efficiently. The distinctions of age and class within the manipular system were erased, and soldiers were equipped uniformly with the pilum, the gladius, and the scutum. This uniformity not only streamlined logistics, but also reinforced the sense of a professional army, bound by shared equipment, training, and identity. Training under the Marian system was relentless. Soldiers drilled daily, marched long distances carrying heavy packs, and practiced construction of fortifications, bridges, and siege works. The legions became self-sufficient military machines, capable of building camps, roads, and supply lines wherever they went. The nickname Muli Mariani, Marius's mules, captured the image of legionaries burdened with gear but hardened into unmatched endurance. This rigorous training forged an army of professionals whose discipline and organisation set them apart from the citizen levies of earlier generations. The impact of these reforms was quickly tested. Marius led his restructured legions against Jugurtha in Numidia, where the war had dragged on inconclusively under aristocratic commanders. His soldiers adapted to the guerrilla tactics of the Numidians, enduring long campaigns in harsh terrain. Eventually, with the aid of his subordinate Lucius Cornelius Sulla, Marius secured Jugurtha's capture and ended the war. The success enhanced his reputation and demonstrated the effectiveness of his new army. Yet it also revealed the growing prominence of ambitious generals whose personal glory was tied to the loyalty of their soldiers. The true test came soon after, when migrating Germanic tribes, the Cimbri and the Teutones, threatened Italy itself. These vast movements of peoples overwhelmed Roman armies in a series of catastrophic defeats, sparking fear that the Republic might face annihilation. Marius, elected consul repeatedly in defiance of traditional norms, took command of the defence. His legions, hardened by training and discipline, confronted the Teutones at Aquae Sextia in 102 BCE and annihilated them. The following year, at Vercellae, Marius destroyed the Cimbri, securing the safety of Italy. These victories earned him the title of the third founder of Rome, after Romulus and Camillus, and confirmed the supremacy of the professional legion. But the triumphs of Marius also carried dangerous precedents. His repeated consulships, justified by emergency, undermined republican traditions of limited office. His reliance on soldiers drawn from the poorest classes bound those men's futures to his political fortunes. When he pushed for land grants and rewards for his veterans, he clashed with the Senate, which resisted his demands. The soldiers' expectation that their commander would secure their post-service livelihood shifted their loyalty from the state to the individual. What had begun as a solution to a manpower crisis had become the foundation for the rise of personal armies. The political consequences were soon visible. Sulla, once Marius's subordinate, rose as a rival, and eventually marched his own legions on Rome itself, something previously unthinkable. The loyalty of soldiers to their general rather than to the Republic had become a reality, and the Marian reforms had made it possible. Over the next century, this dynamic would tear the Republic apart, as ambitious leaders like Pompey, Crassus, and Julius Caesar raised armies more loyal to themselves than to the Senate, leading to civil wars that ended in the fall of the Republic and the rise of the Empire. From the perspective of the individual legionnaire, however, the reforms meant new opportunities. Men who once would have been excluded from service now found a path to status, spoils, and land. Service became a career, with the possibility of advancement to centurion or even higher ranks. Veterans could hope for colonies in conquered territories, securing a livelihood for themselves and their families. The army became a mechanism of social mobility, even as it destabilized the old agrarian order. For countless men, the Marian reforms opened a door into Roman identity that had previously been closed. The transformation of service also reshaped Roman strategy and capability. With a professional, long-serving army, Rome could project power far beyond Italy without relying on seasonal levies. Legions could remain in the field for extended campaigns, garrison provinces, and operate as permanent instruments of Roman authority. The Republic became an imperial state not only in name but in practice, with legions stationed across the Mediterranean, enforcing Roman rule and extending its reach. The Marian reforms had given Rome an army fit for empire, but at the cost of destabilizing the political foundations of the Republic. The psychological identity of the legionnaire was altered as well. No longer a farmer fighting temporarily, he was a soldier for years, bound by oath and discipline, dependent on his general, and shaped by the harsh life of the camp. His loyalty was forged through shared hardship, through the bonds of comradeship, and through the expectation that his commander would secure his future. The legionnaire of Marius was a professional, a man whose identity was military above all else. This transformation marked the end of the old citizen-soldier ethos and the beginning of a new era in Roman military history. The Marian reforms were therefore both a solution and a turning point. They addressed the immediate crisis of manpower and created an army capable of unmatched achievements, but they also altered the delicate balance between citizen, soldier, and state. The republic that emerged from Marius's time was no longer the same as the one that had fought the Punic Wars. Its legions were more formidable than ever, but its politics were increasingly shaped by generals who commanded not only armies, but the personal loyalty of thousands of men. The Republic had gained an empire, but it had also sown the seeds of its own demise. The figure of Julius Caesar stands at the centre of Roman history, not only as a statesman who toppled the Republic, but as a general whose mastery of the legion defined an era. To understand the legionnaire in Caesar's age is to see the Marian reforms brought to their fullest expression, producing armies of professional soldiers whose loyalty, skill, and endurance made them the most formidable fighting force of the ancient world. These men were no longer seasonal levies tied to their farms, but hardened veterans whose entire lives revolved around the camp, the march, and the battlefield. Under Caesar's command, they carried Roman arms into Gaul, across the Rhine, onto the shores of Britain, and finally into civil war, reshaping both the Republic and the destiny of Rome itself. By the time Caesar began his military career, the professional army had become the Republic's standard. Soldiers were recruited from the poorest classes, equipped by the state, and expected to serve for long terms that often extended beyond a decade. They were organised into legions, each consisting of cohorts and centuries, and drilled relentlessly until they could perform manoeuvres with near mechanical precision. Their training and experience created an esprit de corps that bound them more closely to their generals than to the Senate that nominally commanded them. Caesar, more than any other leader of his time, understood how to cultivate this loyalty, transforming the bond between commander and soldier into a personal allegiance that would outlast the Republic itself. Caesar's first great stage was Gaul. In 58 BCE, as proconsul of Cisalpine and Transalpine Gaul, he inherited command of legions already stationed in the region. When the Helvetii, a tribe of Central Europe, attempted to migrate through Roman territory, Caesar seized the opportunity to assert his authority. His legions, disciplined and aggressive, crushed the Helvetii at Bibracte, establishing Caesar as a commander of formidable capability. Over the next 8 years, Caesar led campaigns that brought nearly the entire Gallic world under Roman control. These wars tested the legionnaire in every conceivable way, pitched battles against massive tribal coalitions, sieges of fortified towns, ambushes in forests, and grueling marches across vast distances. The Gallic tribes, though numerous and courageous, lacked the discipline and organisation of the legions. At battles such as the Sambre River and Gergovia, the legionnaires' training, equipment and discipline allowed Roman forces to withstand charges by warriors who fought with ferocious bravery but little coordination. The Roman soldier's heavy shield, short sword and close order formation gave him an advantage in prolonged melee, while the cohort system allowed commanders to manoeuvre units independently, responding quickly to threats. Siege warfare, too, displayed the legionnaire's versatility. At Avaricum, Caesar's troops constructed massive siege works under constant attack, eventually storming the city in a brutal assault that demonstrated both their engineering skill and their ruthlessness. Perhaps the most iconic moment of the Gallic Wars came at Alesia in 52 BCE, when Caesar besieged the stronghold of the Gallic leader Vercingetorix. The task was immense. The fortress was held by a large garrison, while relief armies threatened from outside. Caesar's legions responded with a feat of engineering unmatched in the ancient world. They built a double line of fortifications, one facing inward to contain the defenders, and another facing outward to repel reinforcements. Traps, ditches, palisades, and towers stretched for miles, all constructed under pressure and constant danger. The discipline and skill required to accomplish such works, while maintaining readiness for battle, exemplified the professionalism of the Marian legionnaire in Caesar's age. When the Gallic relief force finally attacked, the legions held firm, repelling assaults from both sides and securing victory that broke Gallic resistance. Caesar's campaigns in Gaul also included daring operations beyond the traditional limits of Roman warfare. Twice he crossed the Rhine River, building massive wooden bridges in a matter of days to intimidate Germanic tribes and demonstrate Roman reach. These constructions, accomplished by legionaries themselves, revealed the extraordinary capacity of the Roman soldier, not only as a fighter, but as an engineer. The legionnaire's identity was not confined to the battlefield. He was equally at home with pickaxe and spade, constructing roads, bridges, and fortifications that extended Roman control. Caesar also launched 2 expeditions to Britain, the first Roman incursions into the island. Though limited in scope, these campaigns displayed the adaptability of the legions, operating across seas and in unfamiliar lands, projecting Roman power far beyond Italy. Life for Caesar's legionnaires in Gaul was harsh and unrelenting. Campaigns stretched through winters, with soldiers building fortified camps in freezing conditions, foraging in hostile territory, and enduring shortages of supplies. Yet their hardships forged resilience and loyalty. Caesar's ability to share in their trials, to march with them, to address them directly, and to reward them generously cemented their devotion. He distributed spoils, promised land grants, and consistently acknowledged their courage in dispatches that circulated through Rome. The image of Caesar as a commander who cared for his men while leading them to unparalleled victories bound the legions to him personally, creating a loyalty that would prove decisive when he turned against the Senate. The wealth and glory brought by the Gallic Wars elevated Caesar's political standing, but also made him a threat to his rivals in Rome. When the Senate, under the influence of Pompey and his allies, demanded that Caesar disband his army, he faced a choice: surrender his command and risk prosecution, or march his legions against the Republic. In 49 BCE, Caesar chose the latter, crossing the Rubicon River with the words, "The die is cast." His legionaries, veterans of years of campaigning, followed him not out of obligation to the Senate but out of personal loyalty. The Marian reforms had created professional soldiers, and Caesar had transformed them into his political base. The civil wars that followed revealed the ultimate consequence of the professional army. At battles such as Pharsalus in 48 BCE, Caesar's legions defeated the larger forces of Pompey, demonstrating superior discipline and cohesion. Against Pompey's cavalry, Caesar innovated by deploying cohorts in reserve to repel flanking manoeuvres, a tactic that relied on the flexibility and training of his men. The legionnaire in Caesar's army was not only a warrior, but an instrument of political revolution. Their victories ensured Caesar's dominance, leading to his dictatorship and the collapse of the republican system of checks and balances. In the civil wars, the legionnaires' loyalty to Caesar was rewarded with land grants, citizenship for provincial recruits, and a share in the spoils of conquest. Entire colonies were founded with veterans, spreading Roman culture and power across the Mediterranean. Yet the precedent was dangerous. Soldiers now expected that their general, not the Senate, would secure their futures. The personal army, born of the Marian reforms and perfected under Caesar, had replaced the citizen militia of earlier generations. The Republic had gained an empire, but it had lost the civic foundation that had once defined it. From the perspective of the individual soldier, Caesar's age offered both hardship and opportunity. The life of the legionnaire was one of endless marches, brutal battles, and exposure to hunger, cold, and disease. Yet it also promised glory, plunder, and advancement. Many rose through the ranks to become centurions, commanding respect and authority. The bonds forged in Caesar's legions were lasting, as men who had served together in Gaul and the civil wars carried their experiences into the new order that followed. They had been the instruments of conquest and revolution, shaping the destiny of Rome more than any Senate debate or law. The image of the legionnaire in Caesar's age became legendary. He was seen as the embodiment of discipline, endurance, and loyalty, capable of building bridges across mighty rivers, storming fortified cities, and marching thousands of miles through hostile lands. His short sword and shield were not only weapons but symbols of an empire in the making. Caesar himself celebrated their deeds in his commentaries, presenting the Roman soldier as both heroic and practical, unyielding in the face of adversity, and guided by the leadership of a commander whose genius matched their devotion. These writings ensured that the legionnaire of Caesar's age would be remembered as the ideal type of Roman soldier, both feared by enemies and admired by posterity. Yet beneath the glory lay the transformation that would ultimately end the Republic. The legionnaire was no longer tied primarily to his farm or his vote, but to his general. His victories secured not the collective will of the Senate, but the ambitions of individuals. The armies of Caesar proved that the fate of Rome could be decided not in its assemblies, but on its battlefields, where the loyalty of soldiers determined political power. The Marian reforms had created the professional army, but in Caesar's hands it became the decisive force that turned the Republic into a personal dominion. When Caesar fell to assassins in 44 BCE, his legionaries were scattered across colonies and provinces, but their influence endured. They had shaped Rome's expansion in Gaul, carried its power across the seas, and determined the outcome of its civil wars. They were the instruments of Caesar's rise and the guardians of his legacy, a new kind of soldier whose identity was inseparable from the ambitions of their commander. The legionnaire in the age of Julius Caesar was both the peak of Roman military effectiveness and the symbol of the Republic's transformation into empire. The fall of the Republic was not the work of a single man, nor the result of a single conflict, but the culmination of decades in which the relationship between Rome's soldiers and its state had been fundamentally altered. The civil wars of the 1st century BCE revealed most clearly that the Roman legionnaire was no longer primarily the servant of the Senate and people of Rome, but the client of individual commanders who provided him with pay, spoils, and the promise of land. This shift in loyalty, gradual at first, became irreversible as ambitious leaders exploited the professional army to advance their own power. By the end of this turbulent era, the Republic that had once prided itself on its citizen soldiers had given way to an empire sustained by armies whose allegiance lay with emperors rather than assemblies. The crisis began with the rivalry between Caesar and Pompey, two men whose careers exemplified the new dynamics of Roman military power. Pompey, known as Magnus for his early victories, had been a commander of extraordinary success, defeating pirates in the Mediterranean, conquering territories in the east, and returning to Rome with immense wealth and prestige. His soldiers adored him, and he used their loyalty to secure political influence. Caesar, after his triumphs in Gaul, had built a similar base of devotion, rooted in years of shared hardship and spectacular victories. Both men commanded armies that were more loyal to them personally than to the Senate, and when their rivalry escalated, the Republic was plunged into open conflict. The crossing of the Rubicon in 49 BCE symbolized this new reality. Caesar's decision to march his legions into Italy, in defiance of senatorial orders, was an act that earlier generations would have considered unthinkable. Yet his soldiers followed him willingly, not because the Senate had commanded it, but because Caesar himself had earned their devotion. They had fought with him in Gaul, shared in the spoils of conquest, and trusted him to secure their rewards. Their allegiance to Caesar outweighed their duty to the Republic, and their march southward marked the beginning of civil war. The battles that followed demonstrated both the discipline of the legions and the degree to which their loyalties had shifted. At Pharsalus, in 48 BCE, Caesar's veterans faced Pompey's larger army, which included many fresh recruits. Despite being outnumbered, Caesar's men, hardened by years of service, executed complex maneuvers with precision, repelling Pompey's cavalry and breaking his lines. Their victory was not merely a triumph of tactics, but a vindication of the personal bond between commander and soldier. Caesar's troops had faced overwhelming odds, but trusted his leadership implicitly. Their devotion turned the tide, and the Senate's authority collapsed in the face of their success. After Pompey's defeat and death in Egypt, Caesar continued to rely on his soldiers to secure his dominance. Campaigns in the eastern Africa, including the Battle of Thapsus against the forces of Cato and Metellus Scipio, and the Battle of Munda in Spain against Pompey's sons, were fought with legions whose loyalty ensured Caesar's supremacy. In each case, the discipline and resilience of the soldiers overcame difficult circumstances. At Munda, Caesar himself had to enter the front lines to rally his men, a gesture that reinforced their devotion and highlighted the mutual dependence of general and soldier. These campaigns made clear that the fate of Rome was no longer determined in its assemblies, but on the battlefields where legions chose their leaders through victory. Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE did not restore the Republic, but plunged it deeper into conflict. The soldiers who had once served him now became pawns in the struggles between his successors. The rivalry between Mark Antony and Octavian, Caesar's heir, drew on the loyalty of veterans who had fought in Gaul and the civil wars. Each faction promised land, money and honour to secure the allegiance of the legions. Veterans were settled in colonies across Italy, often displacing local inhabitants, a practice that created resentment but cemented the soldiers' bond to their patrons. The Republic's institutions, already weakened, were powerless to resist the demands of armies that determined the outcome of every political contest. The Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE, where the forces of Antony and Octavian defeated the armies of Brutus and Cassius, the leaders of Caesar's assassins, revealed the new order. The soldiers fought not for abstract ideals of liberty, or for the Senate, but for the generals who promised to reward them. The victory secured the dominance of Caesar's heirs, but it also entrenched the principle that Rome's destiny was in the hands of those who could command armies. Brutus and Cassius, despite their appeals to restore the Republic, could not match the material promises of Antony and Octavian, and their troops deserted or faltered when victory seemed uncertain. The outcome was decided as much by loyalty and morale as by tactics. The following years saw further conflict as Antony and Octavian turned on one another. Once allies in the Second Triumvirate, they became rivals for supreme power. Again, the loyalty of soldiers was decisive. Antony, supported by Cleopatra of Egypt, commanded forces that included eastern contingents, but Octavian controlled Italy and the loyalty of many veterans who had been settled in colonies. The decisive battle came at Actium in 31 BCE, a naval confrontation where Octavian's Admiral Agrippa secured victory. Yet behind the fleet stood the legions, whose loyalty to Octavian ensured that he could sustain the conflict and ultimately prevail. When Antony and Cleopatra were defeated, Octavian emerged as the sole ruler of Rome, soon to be hailed as Augustus, the first emperor. The shift in loyalty that had begun with the Marian reforms reached its culmination in this period. Soldiers no longer saw themselves primarily as citizens temporarily serving the Republic, but as professionals whose futures depended on the success of their general. They looked to their commander for rewards, land and protection, and in return they gave him their devotion. This personal allegiance could inspire extraordinary feats of endurance and courage, but it also meant that the political system of the Republic, which had relied on the balance of citizen duty and senatorial authority, was unsustainable. The legions had become arbiters of power, and their loyalties determined who ruled Rome. For the legionnaire, this transformation was both empowering and perilous. Service offered opportunities for advancement, plunder and settlement in new colonies, but it also tied his fate to the fortunes of his general. Defeat could mean not only death in battle, but the loss of promised land and security. Soldiers became deeply invested in the success of their leaders, willing to march against fellow Romans if it meant safeguarding their own future. The old ideal of the citizen soldier, fighting for the collective survival of the Republic, had been replaced by a new reality in which soldiers fought for the personal fortunes of their commander, and, by extension, for their own. The culture of the Legion reflected this shift. Veterans spoke of their loyalty to Caesar, Pompey, Antony, or Octavian, rather than to the Senate. Triumphs and rewards were tied to individuals, not institutions. The sacramentum, the oath of loyalty, was now sworn to a general as much as to the state. The stories that circulated in the camps celebrated the charisma and generosity of commanders who shared hardships, addressed the men as comrades, and rewarded bravery with promotions and gifts. The personal relationship between general and soldier had become the heart of Roman military life. Yet this transformation also created instability. Generals who lost battles or fell from power could see their armies dissolve or defect. Soldiers who felt betrayed by broken promises could mutiny, as occurred more than once in the late Republic. The balance between discipline and loyalty was fragile, maintained only so long as generals could provide for their men. The Republic's institutions could not compete with the tangible rewards offered by commanders who controlled the wealth of conquest. The civil wars thus revealed both the strength and the fragility of the new professional army. Strength in its effectiveness on the battlefield, fragility in its dependence on the fortunes of individuals. When Augustus finally emerged as sole ruler, he recognized that the loyalty of the army was the foundation of his power. He reorganized the legions, reduced their numbers, and established permanent bases in the provinces. He introduced regular pay, pensions, and veteran settlements administered by the state rather than left to the promises of individual commanders. In doing so, he sought to institutionalize the loyalty of the legions, binding them to the emperor as the personification of Rome itself. The shift in loyalty that had destroyed the Republic thus became the foundation of the empire, with the legionnaires' devotion redirected from rival generals to a single ruler. The civil wars had tested the legionnaire in ways no foreign enemy ever had. He had marched against fellow Romans, fought in battles that determined not the survival of Rome but the dominance of individuals, and endured the uncertainty of shifting allegiances. His courage and discipline remained constant, but the meaning of his service had changed irrevocably. The soldier of the Republic had fought for the Senate and people of Rome. The soldier of the civil wars fought for Caesar, Pompey, Antony, or Octavian. In this transformation lay the end of the Republic and the beginning of empire, a change wrought not by laws or speeches, but by the loyalty of legionnaires whose swords decided the fate of Rome. When Octavian emerged victorious from the chaos of the civil wars and took the name Augustus, he inherited not only supreme political authority, but also the immense challenge of stabilizing a world that had been fractured by decades of bloodshed. The Republic was dead in all but name, and the new order would have to be built upon institutions capable of maintaining peace, security, and the loyalty of the armies that had become the ultimate arbiters of power. Augustus understood better than anyone that the foundation of his rule would be the legions, and he set about reshaping them into a permanent professional force that served not the Senate, not rival generals, but the emperor himself. The settlement that Augustus crafted was careful in appearance. He cloaked his authority in republican forms, taking titles such as princeps, the first citizen, rather than king or dictator. Yet beneath this facade the reality was clear. Augustus alone commanded the armies, and it was their loyalty that sustained his position. To secure this loyalty, he institutionalized the reforms that had begun with Marius and been distorted by the civil wars, transforming the legions into a standing army with defined terms of service, regular pay, and retirement benefits guaranteed by the state. One of Augustus' first acts was to reduce the number of legions. At the end of the civil wars, dozens of legions existed, many raised by rival commanders and tied to their personal ambitions. Augustus could not maintain so many without risking instability and financial ruin. He disbanded excess units, settled veterans in colonies, and retained only about 25 legions, a number sustainable in both manpower and expense. This reduction not only eased the burden on the treasury, but also concentrated loyalty in a smaller, more manageable force directly under imperial control. The legions that remained were stationed permanently in provinces along the frontiers, rather than being raised and disbanded annually as in the Republic. This marked a decisive shift. The army was no longer a temporary institution summoned for campaigns. It became a constant presence, garrisoning the empire's borders, deterring invasions, and projecting Roman power into hostile lands. Camps were built along the Rhine, the Danube, in Syria and in Egypt, establishing a network of fortified bases from which legions could operate. These camps, often evolving into towns, became centres of Romanization, spreading language, law, and culture deep into the provinces. Service in the legions under Augustus was professionalised. Soldiers enlisted for fixed terms, initially set at 16 years and later extended to 20, with an additional period in reserve. They received regular pay from the state, supplemented by opportunities for booty during campaigns. At the end of their service, they were entitled to pensions or land grants, funded through the aerarium militare, a military treasury established by Augustus to ensure reliable provision for veterans. By institutionalizing these benefits, Augustus removed the uncertainty that had plagued soldiers in the late Republic, when rewards depended on the generosity of individual generals. The soldier now looked to the emperor, not to personal patrons, for his future, binding the legions directly to imperial authority. The discipline and training of the legions reached new levels of rigour under the imperial system. Soldiers drilled constantly, practising formation manoeuvres, weapon skills, and siege techniques. The camp itself became a school of discipline, its layout standardised with streets, barracks, granaries, workshops, and defences built according to fixed plans. Daily routines included construction, maintenance, and practice, ensuring that soldiers were not idle. The nickname Marius's mules lived on, as legionaries carried heavy packs with their gear on long marches, but under Augustus the burden was part of a professional lifestyle, not a temporary hardship. The result was a force capable of rapid deployment, enduring campaigns, and complex engineering feats, unmatched by any other contemporary army. The transformation of the army also reshaped Roman society. Veterans settled in colonies across the empire spread Roman culture and secured loyalty in newly conquered territories. Towns founded by former soldiers dotted Spain, Gaul, North Africa, and the East, creating networks of Roman influence that reinforced the imperial system. These colonies not only rewarded veterans, but also served as instruments of integration, binding diverse provinces into the empire through communities of disciplined, Romanized settlers. The promise of land and citizenship became powerful incentives for service, attracting recruits from across Italy and, increasingly, from the provinces themselves. The composition of the legions gradually shifted in this period. While Italians had once dominated, Augustus expanded recruitment to provincial populations, granting them citizenship upon completion of service. This policy both broadened the pool of manpower and fostered loyalty among provincials, who saw military service as a path to Roman identity and privilege. The army thus became not only a military force, but a vehicle of cultural assimilation, drawing men from Gaul, Spain, the Balkans and beyond into the Roman system. By the end of Augustus's reign, the legions were a mosaic of peoples united by common training, discipline, and loyalty to the emperor. The symbolic role of the legions was also enhanced. Standards, such as the eagle of the legion, became sacred emblems, venerated by soldiers and regarded as symbols of Rome's power. Oaths of loyalty, the sacramentum, were sworn directly to Augustus, reinforcing the personal connection between soldier and emperor. Ceremonies, rituals, and the emperor's personal patronage of the legions created a sense of unity and identity that transcended provincial origins. The legionnaire no longer thought of himself primarily as a citizen soldier of the Republic. but as a professional servant of the emperor and the empire. The campaigns of Augustus's reign tested and demonstrated the effectiveness of this new professional army. In Spain, the legions completed the conquest of the Cantabrian tribes, enduring long and difficult campaigns in rugged terrain. In the Alps, they secured passes vital for communication between Italy and northern provinces. In the east, they established Roman authority in Egypt and Syria, holding strategic positions that controlled trade routes and secured grain supplies. Along the Rhine and Danube, legions confronted Germanic and Dacian tribes, building fortresses and roads that anchored Roman power in the frontier regions. One of the most dramatic episodes of Augustus's reign occurred in 9 CE, when 3 legions under Publius Quintilius Verus were ambushed and destroyed in the Teutoburg forest by Germanic tribes led by Arminius. The loss shocked Rome, shattering ambitions of expansion beyond the Rhine, and reminding the empire of the challenges of frontier warfare. Yet even this disaster underscored the resilience of the professional army. New legions were raised, frontiers fortified, and the army continued its duties without collapse. The ability to absorb such a defeat and maintain stability reflected the strength of Augustus's system. The professionalization of the army also altered the relationship between military and politics. Under the Republic, generals had used their armies to challenge senatorial authority. Under Augustus, the legions were tied directly to the emperor, reducing the likelihood of independent military action. Yet the potential for military power to shape politics was never entirely eliminated. Augustus took care to maintain personal ties with the army, visiting camps, rewarding loyalty, and emphasizing his role as their commander-in-chief. His successors would inherit both the benefits and the risks of this system, for emperors who lost the support of the legions would find their reigns precarious. For the legionnaire himself, life under Augustus offered both hardships and stability. The demands of service remained severe: long campaigns, harsh discipline, and years away from family. Yet the certainty of pay, the promise of rewards, and the prestige of service made the burden bearable. Soldiers could aspire to rise through the ranks, becoming centurions with authority and status. Veterans could expect land or pensions that secured their future. The army was no longer a temporary duty, but a career, offering security in exchange for decades of service. The Augustan settlement thus represents a decisive moment in Roman military history. The legion was no longer the citizen army of the Republic, nor the personal instrument of rival generals, but a professional, permanent force bound to the emperor. It was both the guarantor of Rome's frontiers and the foundation of imperial power. The transformation of the soldier from farmer to professional had been completed, and with it the transformation of Rome itself from republic to empire. The legionnaire of Augustus's age embodied the discipline, endurance, and loyalty that had always characterized the Roman military, but now his service was directed toward a single master, ensuring stability for the state while tying its fate to the loyalty of its armies. When Octavian emerged victorious from the chaos of the civil wars and took the name Augustus, he inherited not only supreme political authority, but also the immense challenge of stabilizing a world that had been fractured by decades of bloodshed. The Republic was dead in all but name, and the new order would have to be built upon institutions capable of maintaining peace, security, and the loyalty of the armies that had become the ultimate arbiters of power. Augustus understood better than anyone that the foundation of his rule would be the legions, and he set about reshaping them into a permanent professional force that served not the Senate, not rival generals, but the emperor himself. The settlement that Augustus crafted was careful in appearance. He cloaked his authority in republican forms, taking titles such as princeps, the first citizen, rather than king or dictator. Yet beneath this facade the reality was clear. Augustus alone commanded the armies, and it was their loyalty that sustained his position. To secure this loyalty, he institutionalized the reforms that had begun with Marius and been distorted by the civil wars. transforming the legions into a standing army with defined terms of service, regular pay, and retirement benefits guaranteed by the state. One of Augustus's first acts was to reduce the number of legions. At the end of the civil wars, dozens of legions existed, many raised by rival commanders and tied to their personal ambitions. Augustus could not maintain so many without risking instability and financial ruin. He disbanded excess units, settled veterans in colonies, and retained only about 25 legions, a number sustainable in both manpower and expense. This reduction not only eased the burden on the treasury, but also concentrated loyalty in a smaller, more manageable force directly under imperial control. The legions that remained were stationed permanently in provinces along the frontiers rather than being raised and disbanded annually as in the Republic. This marked a decisive shift. The army was no longer a temporary institution summoned for campaigns. It became a constant presence, garrisoning the empire's borders, deterring invasions, and projecting Roman power into hostile lands. Camps were built along the Rhine, the Danube, in Syria, and in Egypt, establishing a network of fortified bases from which legions could operate. These camps, often evolving into towns, became centres of Romanization, spreading language, law, and culture deep into the provinces. Service in the legions under Augustus was professionalized. Soldiers enlisted for fixed terms, initially set at 16 years and later extended to 20, with an additional period in reserve. They received regular pay from the state, supplemented by opportunities for booty during campaigns. At the end of their service, they were entitled to pensions or land grants, funded through the Aerarium Militare, a military treasury established by Augustus to ensure reliable provision for veterans. By institutionalizing these benefits, Augustus removed the uncertainty that had plagued soldiers in the late Republic, when rewards depended on the generosity of individual generals. The soldier now looked to the emperor, not to personal patrons, for his future, binding the legions directly to imperial authority. The discipline and training of the legions reached new levels of rigour under the imperial system. Soldiers drilled constantly, practicing formation manoeuvres, weapon skills and siege techniques. The camp itself became a school of discipline, its layout standardised with streets, barracks, granaries, workshops, and defences built according to fixed plans. Daily routines included construction, maintenance, and practice, ensuring that soldiers were not idle. The nickname Marius's mules lived on, as legionaries carried heavy packs with their gear on long marches. But under Augustus, the burden was part of a professional lifestyle, not a temporary hardship. The result was a force capable of rapid deployment, enduring campaigns, and complex engineering feats, unmatched by any other contemporary army. The transformation of the army also reshaped Roman society. Veterans settled in colonies across the empire, spread Roman culture, and secured loyalty in newly conquered territories. Towns founded by former soldiers dotted Spain, Gaul, North Africa, and the East, creating networks of Roman influence that reinforced the imperial system. These colonies not only rewarded veterans but also served as instruments of integration, binding diverse provinces into the empire through communities of disciplined, Romanized settlers. The promise of land and citizenship became powerful incentives for service, attracting recruits from across Italy and increasingly from the provinces themselves. The composition of the legions gradually shifted in this period. While Italians had once dominated, Augustus expanded recruitment to provincial populations, granting them citizenship upon completion of service. This policy both broadened the pool of manpower and fostered loyalty among provincials, who saw military service as a path to Roman identity and privilege. The army thus became not only a military force but a vehicle of cultural assimilation, drawing men from Gaul, Spain, the Balkans, and beyond into the Roman system. By the end of Augustus's reign, the legions were a mosaic of peoples united by common training, discipline, and loyalty to the emperor. The symbolic role of the legions was also enhanced. Standards, such as the Eagle of the Legion, became sacred emblems, venerated by soldiers and regarded as symbols of Rome's power. Oaths of loyalty, the sacramentum, were sworn directly to Augustus, reinforcing the personal connection between soldier and emperor. Ceremonies, rituals, and the emperor's personal patronage of the legions created a sense of unity and identity that transcended provincial origins. The legionnaire no longer thought of himself primarily as a citizen soldier of the Republic, but as a professional servant of the emperor and the empire. The campaigns of Augustus's reign tested and demonstrated the effectiveness of this new professional army. In Spain, the legions completed the conquest of the Cantabrian tribes, enduring long and difficult campaigns in rugged terrain. In the Alps, they secured passes vital for communication between Italy and northern provinces. In the east, they established Roman authority in Egypt and Syria, holding strategic positions that controlled trade routes and secured grain supplies. Along the Rhine and Danube, legions confronted Germanic and Dacian tribes, building fortresses and roads that anchored Roman power in the frontier regions. One of the most dramatic episodes of Augustus's reign occurred in 9 CE, when 3 legions under Publius Quinctilius Varus were ambushed and destroyed in the Teutoburg forest by Germanic tribes led by Arminius. The loss shocked Rome, shattering ambitions of expansion beyond the Rhine and reminding the empire of the challenges of frontier warfare. Yet even this disaster underscored the resilience of the professional army. New legions were raised, frontiers fortified, and the army continued its duties without collapse. The ability to absorb such a defeat and maintain stability reflected the strength of Augustus's system. The professionalization of the army also altered the relationship between military and politics. Under the Republic, generals had used their armies to challenge senatorial authority. Under Augustus, the legions were tied directly to the emperor, reducing the likelihood of independent military action. Yet the potential for military power to shape politics was never entirely eliminated. Augustus took care to maintain personal ties with the army, visiting camps, rewarding loyalty, and emphasizing his role as their commander-in-chief. His successors would inherit both the benefits and the risks of this system, for emperors who lost the support of the legions would find their reigns precarious. For the legionnaire himself, life under Augustus offered both hardships and stability. The demands of service remained severe: long campaigns, harsh discipline, and years away from family. Yet the certainty of pay, the promise of rewards, and the prestige of service made the burden bearable. Soldiers could aspire to rise through the ranks, becoming centurions with authority and status. Veterans could expect land or pensions that secured their future. The army was no longer a temporary duty, but a career, offering security in exchange for decades of service. The Augustan settlement thus represents a decisive moment in Roman military history. The legion was no longer the citizen army of the Republic, nor the personal instrument of rival generals, but a professional, permanent force bound to the emperor. It was both the guarantor of Rome's frontiers and the foundation of imperial power. The transformation of the soldier from farmer to professional had been completed, and with it the transformation of Rome itself from republic to empire. The legionnaire of Augustus's age embodied the discipline, endurance, and loyalty that had always characterized the Roman military. But now his service was directed toward a single master, ensuring stability for the state while tying its fate to the loyalty of its armies. The legionary camp was the heart of Roman military life, the place where discipline was imposed, routines were enforced, and the identity of the soldier was most clearly expressed. To imagine the legion without its camp is impossible, for the two were inseparable. Every day, wherever the legions marched, a camp was established, built to a precise plan, fortified against attack, and laid out with the orderliness of a small city. The camp was not only a place of rest, but a school of discipline, a workshop of engineering, and a symbol of Roman control imposed upon the landscape. The legionnaire lived more of his life inside the camp than in battle, and it was here that the culture of the Roman army was forged. The construction of a camp was itself a ritual of discipline. When a legion halted at the end of a march, it did not simply collapse into rest. Instead, soldiers immediately set to work building a fortified enclosure, regardless of fatigue or weather. Scouts identified a suitable location, ideally elevated ground with access to water and defensible approaches. Once chosen, surveyors marked out the boundaries with precision, using measuring tools to ensure straight lines and right angles. The camp was laid out like a city, with a rectangular plan divided by streets into blocks. The main thoroughfares, the Via Praetoria and Via Principalis, intersected at right angles leading to the headquarters at the centre. The regularity of the layout imposed order on even the most foreign landscape, a visible expression of Roman discipline. Every soldier had a role in construction. Ditches were dug around the perimeter, earth piled into ramparts, and palisades erected from sharpened stakes carried on the march. Towers and gates were built at intervals, ensuring both defence and controlled access. Inside, tents were pitched in exact formation, with each contubernium a squad of 8 men sharing a tent and a section of the camp. The commander's quarters stood at the centre near the Principia, the headquarters where standards and records were kept. Granaries, workshops and stables were laid out in designated areas, creating a miniature city that could house thousands of men in orderly fashion. The routine of construction, repeated every day, trained the legionnaire in discipline and ensured that wherever the army went, it carried Rome with it. Life within the camp followed a strict routine. The day began with the sounding of the buccina, the military trumpet summoning soldiers to assembly. Orders were issued, duties assigned, and guards posted. Watches were maintained throughout the day and night, with soldiers rotating on duty to ensure constant vigilance. Punishments for negligence were severe, for a lapse in discipline could endanger the entire army. Each man knew his responsibilities, from standing guard at the gates to maintaining the defences, from tending animals to preparing rations. The structure of the camp ensured that no soldier was idle, for idleness bred disorder and indiscipline. Meals were taken in common, prepared by the contubernium from rations issued by the army. Grain formed the staple, ground into flour and baked into bread or porridge. Meat, vegetables and wine supplemented the diet when available, often obtained from local foraging or purchased in markets that sprang up outside the camp. Soldiers cooked their own meals, reinforcing self-sufficiency and camaraderie within the tent group. Eating together created bonds of fellowship as the men shared hardships, stories and laughter after long days of labour. The contubernium was the legionnaire's family, the unit with which he marched, ate, slept and fought, and the camp reinforced these bonds daily. Training occupied much of the soldiers' time when not on campaign. Drills were relentless, for discipline had to be maintained even in periods of peace. Soldiers practiced marching in formation, executing manoeuvres on command and wielding their weapons with precision. Wooden swords and heavy shields were used in training to build strength, making real combat weapons feel lighter and more manageable. Throwing the pilum was practiced until it became instinctive, and mock battles kept men prepared for the realities of combat. Beyond combat training, soldiers were taught engineering skills, constructing fortifications, bridges and siege engines. The camp itself was a constant school, where men learned to build roads, dig ditches and erect defences. These tasks instilled habits of obedience and resourcefulness that made the legion more than an army. It was a mobile workforce capable of transforming the landscape. Religious life permeated the camp as well. The standards of the legion, especially the eagle, were housed in the Principia and treated with reverence. Ceremonies were held regularly, sacrifices performed to seek the favour of the gods, and oaths renewed to the emperor. These rituals reinforced the sacred character of military service and bound the soldiers together in shared belief. The camp became a temple as well as a fortress, where divine protection was invoked for the army's endeavours. festivals and rituals punctuated the year, giving rhythm to military life and linking the legionnaire to the broader religious traditions of Rome. Entertainment and recreation were not absent. Soldiers found ways to pass the time through games, gambling with dice, storytelling, and competitions of strength or skill. Music, laughter, and camaraderie filled the spaces between duties, keeping morale high. Outside the camp, traders, artisans, and even families gathered, forming camaraderie, civilian settlements that often grew into towns. These communities provided goods and services to soldiers and created a social world beyond the barracks. Relationships with local populations developed, sometimes leading to unofficial marriages, though formal unions were often restricted until the reign of later emperors. The camp was thus both isolated and connected, a place where soldiers lived apart yet interacted with the wider world around them. Discipline remained the cornerstone of life in the camp. Orders were absolute, and punishments for disobedience severe. Flogging, fines, and hard labour were common penalties, while mutiny could bring mass executions. Collective punishments such as decimation, though rare, were remembered with dread, reminding soldiers that the fate of each depended on the discipline of all. At the same time, rewards were given for valour and service, including decorations, promotions, and shares of booty. The balance of fear and reward sustained the cohesion of the camp, ensuring that each man bore responsibility not only for himself, but for his comrades. The camp also served as a place of administration and record-keeping. Pay was issued, rosters kept, and supplies distributed with bureaucratic efficiency. The Principia housed the archives, where the names and service of soldiers were recorded, ensuring that their pensions and rewards would be honoured. The presence of clerks and officers managing these details underscored the professional nature of the army. A legion was not merely a fighting force, but an institution, with systems of accountability that maintained order across decades of service. For the individual legionnaire, daily life in the camp was a mixture of hardship and stability. The physical labour of building, training and marching was exhausting, but it provided structure and purpose. The bonds of the contubernium offered companionship and support, while the certainty of pay and eventual reward gave meaning to years of service. The camp became a home, familiar in its orderliness no matter how far from Rome it stood. Its walls enclosed not only soldiers, but a way of life that defined the Roman army. The permanence of these routines ensured that the legion could endure in any environment. Whether in the deserts of Syria, the forests of Germany, or the plains of North Africa, the camp reproduced Roman order on foreign soil. Each night, as soldiers settled into their tents, the same streets, defences and rituals surrounded them, creating continuity in the midst of constant movement. The camp was Rome in miniature, carried wherever the legions marched, a fortress of discipline and identity that transformed landscapes and people alike. The endurance of this system shaped the empire itself. Camps grew into towns, towns into cities, and regions into provinces bound by the presence of Roman soldiers. Roads built by legionaries connected these settlements, spreading commerce and culture. The daily life of the soldier, repeated across centuries and provinces, left a permanent mark on the empire's geography and society. The legionary camp was not only the heart of military life, but a seedbed of Roman civilization, planting order and discipline wherever it was raised. The Roman Empire at its height stretched across 3 continents, encompassing territories from the Atlantic coast of Hispania to the deserts of Mesopotamia, from the forests of Germania to the sands of North Africa. Its frontiers were vast, diverse, and often dangerous, and it was along these edges of empire that the legionnaires spent much of their lives. For them, the frontier was not a distant line on a map, but a lived reality of forts, patrols, skirmishes, and constant readiness. The frontiers tested their endurance as much as any great battle, demanding vigilance in the face of enemies who fought with unfamiliar tactics and an environment that was often harsh and unforgiving. To live on the frontier was to be both soldier and settler, guardian of Roman order and participant in a constant negotiation between empire and the peoples beyond. The Rhine and Danube rivers formed one of the most important frontiers. Here the legions faced Germanic tribes whose societies were organised around warrior elites, and whose tactics relied on mobility, ferocity, and knowledge of the forests and swamps. The dense woodlands and unpredictable weather created conditions unlike the open fields where Roman formations excelled. Legionnaires stationed along these rivers spent their days building and maintaining forts, watchtowers, and roads, ensuring that the frontier was not a line of weakness but a zone of control. Patrols crossed the rivers, scouting enemy movements and asserting Roman presence, while traders and emissaries moved back and forth, blurring the distinction between war and diplomacy. Service on the Rhine and Danube was demanding. Winters were bitter, supplies difficult to secure, and sudden raids common. Soldiers lived in stone fortresses and wooden camps, their daily lives shaped by the constant threat of attack. Yet the frontier also offered opportunities. Veterans were often settled in colonies nearby, and civilian communities grew around military bases. Markets thrived, where locals traded with soldiers for Roman goods. Over time, the frontier became not merely a military barrier, but a region of cultural exchange where Roman and Germanic worlds interacted. The legionnaire was both defender and agent of assimilation, carrying Roman language, law, and customs into regions that had never before encountered them. In the east, the frontier presented a different challenge. Rome's boundary with the Parthian Empire, stretching through Syria and Mesopotamia, was defined not by forests but by deserts and open plains. Here the enemies the legions faced were not tribes but another empire, one that commanded cavalry forces of extraordinary skill. Parthian horse archers and cataphracts, armoured cavalry capable of devastating charges, tested the Roman infantry in ways few opponents had. The defeat of Crassus at Carrhae in 53 BCE, where Parthian horsemen annihilated Roman legions in the desert, remained a cautionary tale for centuries. To counter such threats, legionnaires in the east adapted their tactics, building fortified camps with deeper defences, coordinating more closely with allied cavalry, and emphasising flexibility in formations. Life on the eastern frontier was shaped by the great cities of the region. Antioch, Alexandria, and later Palmyra served as centres of supply, trade, and culture. Soldiers stationed in Syria or Judea found themselves in lands where Greek, Aramaic, Jewish, and other traditions mingled, exposing them to customs far removed from Italy. Garrisons were stationed in cities as well as along the desert frontiers, policing restive provinces and guarding against incursions. Rebellions in Judea, including the Great Revolt of 66 CE, revealed the intensity of service in the East, where legionnaires fought not only foreign powers, but also subjects of the empire resisting Roman rule. The siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE, led by Titus, tested the discipline and endurance of the legions as they constructed siege works, assaulted formidable walls, and endured fierce urban combat before storming the city and destroying the temple. Such experiences etched themselves into the memory of soldiers who lived on the frontier, where peace was often fragile and violence never far away. In the north, Britain represented another frontier, one that combined harsh geography with resistant tribes. When Claudius invaded in 43 CE, legions established permanent bases to secure Roman rule. Soldiers spent decades campaigning in the island, pushing deeper into the territory, constructing roads and forts that stretched the empire's reach. Life in Britain was marked by cold, wet conditions, constant skirmishes with tribal groups, and the labour of building monumental works such as Hadrian's Wall in the 2nd century CE. This great barrier, stretching across the island, symbolised both the power of Rome and the reality of frontier life. Legionnaires manned watchtowers, patrolled the countryside, and enforced Roman authority. Living in a landscape where the edge of empire was visible in stone and turf, The wall was not only a defence but a statement, a permanent reminder to friend and foe alike that Rome's order extended even to the ends of the known world. In North Africa, the frontier was defined by deserts and nomadic peoples. The legions stationed there guarded vital resources, including fertile lands and trade routes that connected the Mediterranean to sub-Saharan Africa. Forts and watchtowers dotted the landscape, often linked by roads that cut across barren expanses. Soldiers learned to fight in extreme heat, to patrol vast areas with limited water, and to adapt to enemies who moved swiftly across the desert. Yet the African provinces were also among the wealthiest of the empire, producing grain and goods that sustained Rome itself. Service there combined hardship with prosperity, as soldiers interacted with thriving cities like Carthage and Leptis Magna, centres of culture and commerce that tied Africa firmly into the Roman world. The daily life of a legionnaire on the frontiers was a blend of monotony and sudden danger. Much of his time was spent on construction, patrols, and training, activities that reinforced discipline but often seemed far removed from the glory of battle. Yet at any moment a raid, revolt, or invasion could erupt, thrusting him into combat. This unpredictability shaped the mindset of frontier soldiers, instilling constant readiness and resilience. They were not only warriors, but also guardians of order, their presence alone deterring enemies and enforcing peace. The campfires of legions along the Rhine, the Danube, the Euphrates, and the deserts of Africa were the outermost lights of Roman civilization, flickering against the darkness of the unknown beyond. The psychological experience of frontier service cannot be understated. Soldiers lived far from Italy, often in lands where the language, customs, and landscapes were alien. They forged bonds with their comrades that became their primary source of identity, replacing the ties of home with the fellowship of the legion. Letters, inscriptions, and tombstones reveal soldiers proud of their service, commemorating years spent in distant provinces, often without ever returning to their place of birth. For many, the frontier was not a temporary assignment, but a lifetime, with retirement colonies established nearby where veterans settled, married locals, and left descendants who blended Roman and provincial traditions. The frontier thus became both a military barrier and a crucible of cultural transformation. The strategic importance of the legions on the frontiers was immense. They deterred invasions from peoples such as the Germans, Dacians, Parthians, and later the Sassanids. They suppressed revolts in provinces that resisted Roman rule. They built roads, bridges, and cities that extended imperial control. Their presence reassured loyal populations while intimidating hostile ones. The legions were not only the sword of Rome but its shield, absorbing the first blows of enemies and ensuring that the heartlands of the empire remained secure. Without them, the vast territories of Rome could not have been maintained, for political authority alone was insufficient to hold such a diverse and sprawling dominion. The frontier also shaped the evolution of the legion itself. Constant exposure to new enemies forced adaptation in weapons, tactics, and organisation. Cavalry auxiliaries were integrated more fully to counter-mounted opponents. Siege techniques were refined through repeated urban conflicts. Fortifications grew more sophisticated, incorporating stone walls and permanent structures. The experience of frontier warfare transformed the legions from mobile campaigning forces into institutions of occupation and control, blending military might with administrative stability. For the legionnaire, service on the frontier was both hardship and honour. He endured cold, heat, hunger, and isolation, but he also stood at the edge of history, part of the machinery that extended Roman civilization to its limits. The stones of Hadrian's Wall, the roads of Syria, the forts of the Danube, and the watchtowers of Africa all bear witness to his labour. His life was not lived in the glory of Rome's capital, but in the mud of remote outposts, the dust of deserts, and the forests of hostile lands. Yet it was through his service that the empire endured, its borders guarded and its provinces secured. The legionnaire on the frontier was the embodiment of Rome's reach, the guardian of its order, and the builder of its legacy. The reputation of the Roman legions rested not only on their discipline in battle, but also on their extraordinary skill as engineers. Wherever the legions went, they carried with them the tools and knowledge to shape the landscape in ways that supported conquest, ensured supply, and displayed the power of Rome. Engineering was not a side task to fighting, but a central part of the legionnaires' identity. Roads, bridges, aqueducts, siege engines, and fortifications were as much their weapons as the gladius and pilum. Through engineering, the legions extended their endurance, maintained their mobility, and projected their strength far beyond the immediate reach of their swords. The Roman military machine was not simply an army of warriors, it was an army of builders whose works endured for centuries after the empire itself faded. Roads were among the most visible achievements of Roman military engineering. Built primarily for the movement of troops, they became the arteries of empire, linking distant provinces to the capital and allowing armies to march with speed and efficiency. The construction of a Roman road was a feat of precision and labour, undertaken by legionaries themselves under the supervision of engineers and surveyors. A straight line was plotted across the landscape whenever possible, marked with gromus to ensure accuracy. The ground was excavated, layers of stone, gravel and sand were laid, and a paved surface of fitted stones or compacted gravel was placed on top. Ditches for drainage lined the sides, and milestones marked distances, creating a network that was both durable and navigable. Marching along these roads, legionaries could cover distances far greater than their enemies, arriving at battlefields with speed that often surprised opponents. Supply wagons could follow more easily, ensuring that armies remained provisioned even on long campaigns. Roads connected forts, camps and cities, creating a web of communication that held the empire together. The Via Appia, the Via Flaminia, and countless provincial roads were not only pathways for soldiers, but symbols of Roman order, cutting across landscapes and binding them into a single system. Even centuries later, many of these roads continued to serve European transport, testifying to the durability of the legionnaires' work. Bridges were another essential element of Roman military engineering. Rivers often formed natural barriers that could slow or halt armies, but the Romans turned these obstacles into opportunities to display their ingenuity. Legionaries could construct wooden bridges with astonishing speed, driving piles into riverbeds, lashing beams with iron clamps, and decking the spans with planks. The most famous example came during Caesar's Gallic campaigns, when his legions built a bridge across the Rhine in a matter of days. The feat was not undertaken merely to cross, but to demonstrate Roman power to the Germanic tribes. Once across, Caesar's troops made a show of force before dismantling the bridge, leaving a lasting impression that no river could shield Rome's enemies. Bridges were thus both practical tools of movement and psychological weapons, reminders of the legion's ability to impose order upon nature itself. The camp, constructed daily on campaign, was a masterpiece of engineering discipline. Every evening legionaries erected ditches, ramparts, palisades and gates, creating a fortified enclosure that ensured safety at night and order within. The speed with which a camp could be built astonished observers. Even large legions could entrench themselves securely within hours of halting. Inside the camp, streets were laid out in a regular grid, tents erected in precise rows, and headquarters placed at the centre. These camps were not temporary shelters but fortified bases capable of resisting sudden attacks. The practice of building them day after day trained soldiers in construction techniques and kept discipline sharp even when battles were rare. The camp symbolised the Roman approach to war, methodical, organised and unrelenting in imposing structure upon chaos. Siege warfare was another arena in which Roman engineering shone. Cities and fortresses that resisted Rome often faced not only the courage of the legions but their machines of destruction. Legionaries constructed towers, battering rams, catapults and ballistae, weapons that hurled stones, bolts and fire against defenders. They built ramps and covered shelters to protect attackers as they approached walls. At Masada in Judea, they raised a massive earthen ramp against a mountain fortress, enabling them to bring siege engines to the top and overwhelm the defenders. At Alesia in Gaul, they constructed double lines of fortifications stretching for miles, both to contain the enemy and to repel relief forces. Such feats required not only technical skill, but immense labour, carried out by soldiers who were as adept with spade and hammer as with sword and shield. Aqueducts, canals, and other infrastructure also fell within the scope of military engineering. In new provinces, legionaries built water systems to supply garrisons and settlements, ensuring that Roman order could be sustained in hostile or arid environments. They drained marshes, redirected rivers, and dug channels that altered entire landscapes. Their skill in hydraulics enabled them to sustain armies in places where local populations had long struggled to secure reliable water. This ability to manipulate the environment gave Rome a decisive advantage, allowing its armies to remain in the field longer than enemies who depended on local supplies. The Roman military machine also excelled in logistics. Supplying thousands of men across vast distances required systems of storage, transport, and distribution that few other societies could match. Granaries were built in forts and camps, capable of storing grain in quantity sufficient to feed legions for months. Roads and rivers carried supplies from central depots to frontier garrisons, while ships transported goods across the Mediterranean. Soldiers themselves carried portions of supplies, reducing dependence on wagons and ensuring mobility. The organisation of logistics was as important as battlefield tactics, for hunger and want could defeat an army as surely as swords. The legion's ability to sustain themselves far from home allowed them to conquer and hold territories that would have been unreachable to less organised forces. The integration of engineering into daily military life meant that every legionary was both fighter and builder. Training included not only weapons practice, but also construction tasks. Soldiers learned to quarry stone, cut timber, shape iron, and erect structures. This versatility made the Roman army unique, capable of transforming itself into a workforce that could build roads, bridges, aqueducts, and cities wherever it went. The empire's infrastructure was thus inseparable from its military, for it was the legionnaire who laid the stones, raised the walls, and dug the ditches that spread Roman civilization. The psychological impact of Roman engineering on enemies was profound. To see a Roman army arrive at one's borders and within days construct a fortified camp, a bridge across a river, or siege works encircling a city, was to witness the unstoppable nature of Rome's power. The legions seemed less like men and more like a machine, inexhaustible in labour and precise in execution. Opponents often marvelled at the speed and skill of Roman construction, recognising that they faced not only soldiers, but an entire system of order imposed upon the landscape. The durability of Roman engineering ensured that its legacy outlived the empire. Roads continued to guide travel, bridges spanned rivers for centuries, and cities built by legionary labour became permanent fixtures of the European and Mediterranean world. Even ruins today bear witness to the skill of soldiers who, between battles, transformed stone and earth into enduring monuments. The military machine of Rome was thus not only destructive but creative, leaving behind a world remade in its image. For the legionnaire, engineering was part of his identity. He was expected to labour with pickaxe and spade as readily as with sword, to march carrying stakes for camp palisades, to build roads under the sun, and to raise walls under enemy fire. This labour was exhausting, but it gave meaning to service and instilled habits of obedience and resourcefulness. The soldier knew that his work was building not only a camp for the night, but the infrastructure of an empire. His sweat laid the stones on which Roman power marched, and his endurance ensured that Rome's armies could move and fight in places where no other power could. The Roman military machine was therefore a fusion of discipline, engineering and logistics, as formidable in construction as in combat. It was this combination that allowed Rome to expand and maintain an empire across continents, for no enemy could match its ability to impose order on the landscape. Roads carried soldiers swiftly, bridges defied rivers, camps secured knights, siege engines toppled walls, and aqueducts sustained settlements. Behind every battlefield victory lay countless hours of labour, carried out by legionnaires whose picks and shovels were as essential as their blades. The Roman soldier was the embodiment of this system, the living engine of an empire whose roads and ruins remain to this day. For the Roman legionnaire, the world of military life was not only one of discipline, labour and combat, but also one infused with ritual and belief. Religion permeated the fabric of the army, binding soldiers together, sanctifying their service, and placing their struggles within the cosmic order of Rome and its gods. To fight for Rome was to fight under divine protection, and every oath sworn, every sacrifice offered, and every standard raised reminded the soldier that his duty was not merely political or martial, but sacred. The legionary camp was as much a place of worship as of training, its daily rhythms marked by ceremonies that reinforced the unity of the army and its connection to the divine. At the heart of this spiritual world stood the oath of loyalty, the sacramentum. Each soldier, upon entering service, swore solemnly to obey his commanders and never abandon his comrades. This oath was not a casual promise, but a sacred vow, binding the legionnaire to Rome and its leader with religious force. To break it was not only treason but sacrilege, a crime against the gods as well as against men. The act of swearing the sacramentum was a rite of passage, transforming the recruit from an ordinary citizen into a soldier, marked by a bond that would last for the duration of his service. The oath reinforced discipline, for it placed obedience within a divine framework, and it underscored the seriousness of military duty, reminding each man that his loyalty was sanctified by the gods themselves. The standards of the legion were also objects of profound reverence. Chief among them was the aquila, the eagle, the symbol of the legion's spirit and fortune. Carried into battle by the aquilifer, the eagle was treated as sacred, housed in a shrine within the camp's headquarters and honoured with ceremonies. To lose the eagle in battle was the greatest disgrace a legion could suffer, while to capture one from the enemy was the highest glory. Soldiers swore their loyalty upon the standards, offering prayers and sacrifices before them. The standards were not mere banners but living symbols of the legion's identity, embodying its honour and its bond with the gods. Their presence on the battlefield inspired courage, while their preservation in camp reinforced unity. Ritual sacrifice was a constant feature of military life. Before battles, animals were offered to the gods, their entrails examined by haruspices to read omens. The will of the gods was consulted at every turn, for Romans believed that victory depended as much on divine favour as on human skill. If omens were unfavourable, battles might be delayed or strategies altered. Soldiers participated in these rituals, watching as priests or commanders made offerings, and their confidence was shaped by the interpretation of signs. Success in battle was attributed not only to courage and discipline, but to the approval of the gods, and defeats were often explained as the result of neglecting ritual or offending divine powers. Festivals and religious observances also punctuated the soldier's year. The army celebrated the same festivals as the wider Roman world, Saturnalia, the Perilia, the Feriae Latinae, but often with adaptations suited to military life. Sacrifices were made to Mars, the god of war, who was invoked as the protector of the army. Jupiter, supreme among the gods, was honoured as the guarantor of Rome's destiny. Votive offerings were made for victories, and temples were built in provinces to commemorate the favour of the gods in conquest. In this way, the army carried Roman religion into distant lands, planting its rituals wherever the legions marched. The personal piety of soldiers was diverse. Inscriptions and archaeological evidence reveal that legionaries worshipped not only the traditional Roman gods, but also deities from the provinces in which they served. Mithras, a Persian god associated with the sun and with mystery cult rituals, became especially popular among soldiers, whose lives of discipline and camaraderie resonated with the Mithraic emphasis on initiation, loyalty and shared meals. Temples to Mithras, known as Mithraea, were built near forts and camps across the empire, from Britain to the Danube to the east. Here, soldiers gathered in subterranean spaces to perform rituals of initiation, share sacred banquets, and affirm their brotherhood in a faith that promised protection and eternal life. Other deities too found places in the soldier's heart. Egyptian gods such as Isis and Serapis, Celtic and Germanic deities from frontier provinces, and local spirits of rivers, forests and mountains were all incorporated into the religious lives of legionaries. Military life exposed soldiers to a wide variety of traditions, and many adopted or blended foreign gods into their personal devotions. This religious pluralism enriched the spiritual world of the army, creating a tapestry of belief that reflected both the diversity of the empire and the adaptability of Roman religion. Rituals also marked key moments in the soldier's life. Upon enlistment, the sacramentum initiated him into service. Promotions were accompanied by ceremonies of recognition, often with gifts or decorations presented before the standards. Victories were celebrated with sacrifices and feasts, while fallen comrades were honoured with funerary rites, their names recorded and remembered. Death on campaign was a constant reality, and soldiers often carried amulets or inscribed dedications to gods for protection. Graves of legionaries frequently bore inscriptions invoking divine guardianship, revealing the central place of religion in giving meaning to lives cut short by war. The emperor himself occupied a sacred place in the religious life of the legion. From Augustus onward, the emperor was not only commander-in-chief but also a figure of divine reverence. Soldiers swore oaths directly to him, and his image was honoured in ceremonies. Temples and altars to the genius of the emperor were established in camps, reinforcing the personal bond between soldier and ruler. This cult of the emperor integrated political loyalty with religious devotion, ensuring that allegiance to the state was sanctified by ritual. The soldier was reminded daily that his service was not only for Rome, but for the living embodiment of Rome's authority in the person of the emperor. The rituals of the army served practical purposes as well. They fostered unity, instilled confidence, and reinforced discipline. In the face of danger, soldiers drew strength from the belief that the gods favoured them, that their standards were sacred, and that their oaths bound them to one another. The shared experience of sacrifice and prayer created bonds of fellowship that extended beyond the contubernum to the entire legion. Religion gave meaning to suffering, sanctified obedience, and provided explanations for victory and defeat. It was the invisible armour that sustained the soldier in the hardships of frontier life and the terror of battle. Yet religion in the legions was not static. Over time, the adoption of new cults, especially Mithraism and later Christianity, transformed the spiritual life of the army. The resilience of Mithraic worship among soldiers well into the 3rd and 4th centuries reflects how deeply the themes of loyalty, secrecy and brotherhood resonated with military culture. With the rise of Constantine and the Christianization of the empire, new rituals gradually replaced old ones, and the cross became as familiar a symbol in camps as the eagle had once been. Even then, the essence remained the same. The legionnaire's life was bound by ritual, oath, and belief, his service sanctified by the divine. For the legionnaire, religion was not an abstract philosophy, but a lived reality woven into every part of his service. From the oath that bound him to his comrades, to the sacrifices that preceded battle, to the prayers whispered at night in his tent, the divine accompanied him at every step. The standards reminded him of his legion spirit. The festivals tied him to Rome, and the cults of foreign gods gave him solace in distant lands. Religion and ritual gave shape to his world, just as discipline and training shaped his body. Together they created the soldier who stood at the heart of Rome's empire, at once warrior, builder, and devotee, carrying not only weapons but the sacred traditions of his people wherever he marched. The legions that marched eastward into the lands of Parthia and beyond faced a world unlike any they had encountered in Italy, Gaul, or even the frontiers of Germania. In the west, Rome's enemies had been tribal warriors whose courage was immense, but whose organisation often faltered before the discipline of the legions. In the east, they confronted not only peoples but empires, states with their own armies, resources and traditions of warfare that matched Roman ambition. The most formidable of these was Parthia, a successor of the Persian traditions, master of cavalry, and Rome's chief rival across the Euphrates. For generations, the struggle between Rome and Parthia would define the eastern frontier, a contest that revealed both the strengths and the limits of the legionary system. The origins of Roman involvement in the east lay in the ambitions of the Republic's generals, who, enriched by conquests in the west, turned their gaze to the wealthy lands of Asia. The campaigns of Lucullus and Pompey in the 1st century BCE brought Syria and Asia Minor under Roman control, extending the frontier to the Euphrates. Yet it was Marcus Licinius Crassus who sought to carry Rome's arms into Parthian territory, dreaming of a conquest that would rival Alexander the Great. In 53 BCE, he marched east with 7 legions, confident that the discipline of Roman infantry could overcome Parthian horsemen. The result was the disaster at Carrhae, one of the most devastating defeats in Roman history. The Parthians, commanded by Serena, fielded a force of horse archers and heavily armoured cavalry, the cataphracts. They harassed the Romans with volleys of arrows from a distance, their horses carrying vast reserves of ammunition supplied by camels. When Roman infantry tried to close, the cataphracts charged with lances that shattered their formations. Crassus's legions, heavy and slow, were unable to force a decisive engagement, trapped in the open plains where their discipline availed them little against the mobility of their opponents. Crassus himself was killed, his army annihilated, and the captured Roman standards displayed in Parthian triumph. The defeat shocked Rome, exposing vulnerabilities in its military system and casting a shadow over its eastern ambitions. Yet Rome did not abandon the frontier. Decades later, under Augustus, diplomacy restored some of the lost honour, with Parthia returning captured standards as a gesture of goodwill. This symbolic victory was celebrated in Rome with monuments and rituals, transforming a diplomatic settlement into a triumph of imperial prestige. The gesture also highlighted the balance of power in the east. Neither Rome nor Parthia could decisively conquer the other, and their rivalry settled into a contest of influence, with Armenia often serving as the battleground for their competing ambitions. Legionnaires stationed in the east found themselves engaged not only in major campaigns, but in constant manoeuvring around Armenia, Syria and Mesopotamia. Garrisons secured cities, built roads, and manned fortresses along the Euphrates. The environment challenged them with scorching heat, arid deserts, and long supply lines stretching back to the Mediterranean. The contrast with the forests of the Rhine or the damp fields of Britain could not have been sharper. In these harsh lands, Roman soldiers adapted their routines, learning to endure thirst, heat, and dust while maintaining their discipline. Under emperors such as Trajan, Roman ambitions pushed beyond the Euphrates once more. In the early 2nd century CE, Trajan launched a massive campaign into Parthian territory, capturing Mesopotamian cities and advancing to the Persian Gulf. For a brief moment, Rome seemed poised to extend its empire to the limits of the known world. Legionaries marched through Babylon, Seleucia and Ctesiphon, ancient cities that had once been at the heart of empires older than Rome itself. Yet the vast distances, hostile environment, and difficulty of sustaining supply lines soon made the conquest untenable. Trajan's successor Hadrian withdrew to defensible borders, recognizing that Rome's strength lay not in endless expansion but in consolidation. The legions, however, carried the memory of these campaigns, of marching through lands associated with legendary kings and conquerors, a reminder that their service placed them at the crossroads of civilizations. Later emperors renewed the struggle. Lucius Verus in the mid-2nd century campaigned against Parthia, achieving temporary victories but leaving little permanent change. Septimius Severus in the early 3rd century again invaded Mesopotamia, sacking Ctesiphon and briefly annexing territory. These campaigns revealed the adaptability of the legions, capable of advancing deep into enemy lands, building siege works against fortified cities, and enduring the challenges of desert warfare. Yet they also revealed the limits of Roman power. Each conquest proved difficult to sustain, and the cycle of invasion and withdrawal repeated, leaving the eastern frontier perpetually unstable. The rise of the Sassanid dynasty in Persia in the 3rd century intensified the conflict. Unlike the Parthians, who often relied on a feudal cavalry system, the Sassanids built a centralized empire with formidable armies and aggressive leaders. Their challenge to Rome was relentless, and legionaries stationed in the east faced campaigns of increasing intensity. Cities such as Antioch, Dura Europos, and Nisibis became focal points of defence, their walls manned by Roman soldiers against repeated assaults. The capture of the Emperor Valerian by the Sassanid king Shapurdas in 260 CE, when an entire Roman army was destroyed, underscored the dangers of the frontier and the resilience required of soldiers who faced an enemy equal in determination and organisation. The Eastern campaigns also exposed legionaries to cultures and religions that enriched their lives and broadened their horizons. In Syria, soldiers encountered Greek and Semitic traditions. In Judea, they confronted Jewish resistance and revolts. And in Mesopotamia, they encountered the ancient legacies of Babylonian and Persian civilization. These experiences shaped their identities, and many adopted local customs, deities, and even families. Inscriptions from frontier towns reveal soldiers dedicating altars to Eastern gods, while archaeological remains show Roman forts side by side with local temples. The legionary was not only a warrior but a participant in cultural exchange, carrying Rome's traditions eastward while absorbing influences in return. The campaigns in Judea highlight another aspect of service in the East, the suppression of internal revolts, as well as defence against external threats. The Jewish revolts of the 1st and 2nd centuries CE demanded sustained operations by the legions, who faced determined resistance in cities and fortresses. The siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE, during which the temple was destroyed, was a defining moment in Roman military history. Legionaries built massive siege works, stormed walls under heavy fire, and engaged in brutal street fighting once the city fell. Later, during the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 2nd century, they faced guerrilla tactics and fortified caves, campaigns that drained Roman resources but demonstrated the persistence of its soldiers. For the legionnaire, these operations demanded not only endurance, but also the ability to adapt to unconventional warfare in difficult terrain. The eastern frontier also shaped the evolution of Roman military organisation. The need to counter cavalry forces led to the greater use of auxiliary units, skilled in mounted combat. Archers from the east, cavalry from Thrace and Numidia, and specialised troops were integrated into Roman armies, complementing the heavy infantry of the legions. Fortifications became more permanent, with stone walls replacing temporary camps in key locations. The Eastern campaigns thus contributed to the transformation of the Roman military into a more flexible and diverse force, capable of confronting different enemies across varied terrains. For the legionnaire himself, service in the East was both hardship and honour. The long marches through deserts, the blazing sun, the endless dust, and the scarcity of water tested endurance to its limits. Yet victories against powerful enemies brought immense prestige. To fight against Parthia or Persia was to stand at the pinnacle of Rome's military tradition, facing foes who commanded respect even in Rome. The stories of comrades captured or killed, of emperors defeated or triumphant, circulated in the camps, shaping the collective memory of those who served on the frontier. The East was not a marginal posting, but the stage of epic struggles that defined Rome's place in the world. In the end, the campaigns in Parthia and beyond did not bring lasting conquest, but they revealed the extraordinary resilience of the legionary system. Again and again, soldiers marched into hostile lands, endured defeats, rebuilt their strength, and returned to the fight. They built fortresses in deserts, crossed rivers with bridges of their own making, and stormed cities that had stood for centuries. The eastern frontier remained a place of struggle throughout the empire's history, but it also became a crucible of adaptation, where the Roman soldier proved his capacity not only to fight, but to endure, to build, and to hold in the face of an equal adversary. The northern frontiers of Rome brought the legions face to face with some of their most enduring challenges, for the landscapes of Gaul, Germania, and Britannia presented environments far removed from the Mediterranean heartland, and the peoples they confronted fought with ferocity, resilience, and deep knowledge of their homelands. In the rolling hills and forests of Gaul, in the dark and endless woodlands of Germania, and on the windswept islands of Britain, the legionary was tested in ways that shaped not only his military traditions, but the very image of Rome's expansion. These campaigns were not brief encounters, but generations of struggle, conquest, and occupation, during which the discipline of the legion and the persistence of Roman engineering sought to impose order upon lands that resisted it fiercely. In Gaul, the conquest led by Julius Caesar in the 1st century BCE revealed the full capacity of the legionary system. The Gallic tribes were numerous, wealthy, and accustomed to war, their warriors charging with courage and their chieftains uniting in coalitions when threatened. Yet the Roman legions, disciplined and organised into cohorts, proved capable of absorbing their charges and breaking their lines with steady resilience. Battles such as the Somme, where Caesar's men held firm against overwhelming numbers, showcased the legionnaires' endurance under pressure. The siege of Alesia in 52 BCE, where Caesar's army encircled Vercingetorix with vast lines of fortification, demonstrated their engineering brilliance and discipline, for they built walls facing inward to contain the besieged and outward to repel relief forces. Such feats were beyond the capacity of tribal coalitions, and the fall of Alesia marked the end of large-scale resistance. Yet victory did not come without hardship. The campaigns in Gaul demanded relentless marching through forests and rivers, sieges of fortified oppida, and struggles against ambushes in difficult terrain. The legionary carried his heavy pack, his weapons and his stakes for camp palisades across landscapes where supply was uncertain and weather harsh. Disease, hunger, and fatigue accompanied him, yet the bonds of his contubernum and the certainty of Roman discipline carried him through. When Gaul was finally subdued, the legions had not only conquered territory, but also absorbed new peoples into the empire, planting colonies, building roads, and spreading Roman law. The Gauls, once enemies, became allies and soldiers in Rome's armies, their lands transformed into one of the most important provinces of the empire. Germania presented a different kind of challenge. Beyond the Rhine, dense forests, marshes, and rivers created a landscape where Roman formations struggled to maneuver, and the tribes who lived there excelled at ambush and surprise. Early attempts at conquest, begun under Augustus, aimed to push the frontier to the Elbe. Legions built roads and forts deep into Germanic territory, but the disaster in the Teutoburg forest in 9 CE changed the course of history. 3 legions under Varus were annihilated by the forces of Arminius, a Germanic chieftain who had once served as a Roman auxiliary and understood Roman methods. In the narrow forest paths, the disciplined formations of the legions became vulnerable, their cohesion broken by terrain and surprise. Surrounded and harried for days, the soldiers were cut down, their standards captured, their bodies left unburied in the mud. The defeat sent shockwaves through the empire. Augustus himself is said to have wandered the palace crying for his lost legions, and expansion into Germania was abandoned. From then on, the Rhine and the Danube became the empire's defensive line. Legionaries stationed there built massive fortresses and watchtowers, their presence a constant reminder of Roman determination, but they no longer sought to push the frontier far into the Germanic interior. Instead, the legions patrolled, engaged in punitive expeditions and defended crossings, adapting to a form of warfare in which the enemy could appear suddenly and vanish into the woods. The soldiers learned to respect their foes, who fought with ferocity, loyalty to their tribes, and a deep knowledge of their land. For centuries, Germania remained a place of raids and counter-raids, where legionaries endured winters in stone forts and watched the forests for signs of movement. Britain, conquered under the Emperor Claudius in 43 CE, posed yet another set of trials. The legions who crossed the Channel landed in a land of rolling hills, mist and marshes, inhabited by Celtic tribes whose chariots and guerrilla tactics tested Roman methods. Initial campaigns pushed deep into the island, establishing bases and roads, while fortresses were built to secure conquered territory. Yet resistance persisted, erupting dramatically in the revolt of Boudicca in 60 CE. The Queen of the Ursini led a massive uprising that swept across Roman settlements, destroying towns such as Londinium and slaughtering thousands. The legionaries who faced her forces were outnumbered, but their discipline and tactics carried the day. In the climactic battle, they formed tight ranks, absorbed the rush of warriors, and counterattacked with devastating effect, crushing the revolt. The episode revealed both the vulnerability of Roman occupation and the resilience of the legionary in restoring order. In the north of Britain, further challenges awaited. Successive campaigns pushed towards Scotland, where tribes resisted fiercely and the terrain favoured defenders. Forts were built, roads cut through hills, and camps established. But the cost of maintaining control was immense. Under Hadrian in the 2nd century, a decision was made to construct a permanent barrier, Hadrian's Wall. Stretching across the island, manned by legionaries and auxiliaries, it marked the northern limit of Roman expansion. Soldiers stationed along the wall lived in stone forts, patrolled the frontier, and watched the movements of tribes beyond. Later, Antoninus Pius pushed the frontier further with another wall in Scotland, but it was eventually abandoned, and Hadrian's Wall remained the enduring symbol of Rome's northern limit. For the legionary, life on the wall meant years of routine: patrols, construction, training, and occasional raids, yet also exposure to new peoples, cultures, and landscapes at the edge of the known world. The campaigns in the north were as much about building as about fighting. Roads such as Watling Street in Britain, or the great networks of Gaul and along the Rhine connected forts and settlements, enabling rapid movement of troops and supplies. Towns grew around camps, markets flourished, and local populations became intertwined with the soldiers who garrisoned their lands. Veterans settled in colonies, spreading Roman culture, law, and language. The presence of the legions was transformative, reshaping societies that once resisted Rome into provinces that supplied soldiers, taxes, and trade. Yet the memory of resistance never entirely faded, and in times of weakness Rome faced renewed uprisings from the same peoples who had once fought Caesar or confronted Varus. For the legionnaire, service in Gaul, Germania, and Britannia demanded resilience beyond the battlefield. He endured cold, rain, mud, and long marches through forests and hills. He constructed forts, cut roads, and stood watch against sudden raids. He faced enemies whose courage and tactics demanded respect, whether the massed charges of Gallic warriors, the ambushes of Germanic tribes, or the guerrilla attacks of Celtic chariots. He lived in lands far from the sunlit Mediterranean, where the mists of morning and the chill of winter shaped his daily existence. Yet he also experienced the pride of conquest, the satisfaction of order imposed, and the knowledge that he was part of Rome's effort to bring its civilization to the edges of the known world. The northern campaigns reveal the dual nature of the legionary system, its capacity to conquer and its capacity to hold. In Gaul, conquest led to integration, transforming enemies into allies. In Germania, limits were recognized. and the frontier became a line of defence. In Britannia, conquest was partial, marked by fortifications and resistance that persisted for centuries. The legionary in all these lands was the instrument of Rome's policy, adapting to forests, marshes and islands, building where he could, fighting where he must, enduring always. His service in the north shaped the destiny of the empire, ensuring its reach extended to lands once thought beyond Roman imagination, and leaving behind walls, roads and memories that endure to this day. The 3rd century of Rome's history was a time of turbulence unlike any that had come before, a century in which the legions, once the bedrock of imperial stability, found themselves stretched thin, battered by external invasions, internal revolts, economic upheaval, and political chaos. For nearly 50 years, emperors rose and fell in rapid succession, often elevated by the very soldiers they commanded, and just as often struck down by rival armies. The loyalty of the legionnaire, already reshaped in earlier centuries by the shift from republic to empire, was tested as never before. His endurance was no longer measured only on the battlefield, but in his capacity to withstand the strain of a world where Rome's power seemed perpetually on the verge of collapse. The crisis began with a convergence of threats that struck from all sides. On the northern frontiers, Germanic tribes pressed across the Rhine and Danube, launching raids that penetrated deep into Roman territory. The Goths emerged as a formidable force, crossing the Black Sea and ravaging provinces that had once been secure. In the east, the rise of the Sassanid dynasty in Persia brought an aggressive and organised enemy who sought to reclaim lands once held by earlier empires. Their armies, led by ambitious kings such as Chapelthari, launched repeated invasions into Roman Syria and Mesopotamia, defeating Roman forces and even capturing the Emperor Valerian in 260 CE. Meanwhile, within the empire itself, ambitious generals used their legions to seize the purple, leading to a succession of emperors, many of whom ruled for only months or years before being overthrown. For the legionnaire, this meant a life of constant movement and unrelenting conflict. No longer could he expect to garrison a province for long periods of stability. Instead, he was marched from frontier to frontier, called upon to fight Germans one year, Persians the next, and fellow Romans the year after. The empire's vastness, once its strength, became a source of weakness, as crises erupted faster than they could be contained. Soldiers endured endless campaigns, their pay often debased by inflation, their loyalty sought by every commander who promised donatives or spoils. The old certainties of steady service, predictable rewards, and clear allegiance to a single emperor dissolved in the chaos of competing claimants to power. The strain on the legions was not only physical but psychological. They were still the most disciplined force in the world, but discipline frayed when armies were used as political tools. Soldiers elevated generals to emperorship not out of loyalty to Rome but in the hope of better pay or rewards. When those rewards failed, mutinies broke out, emperors were abandoned and new leaders proclaimed. The empire saw dozens of rulers in rapid succession, a time historians later called the crisis of the 3rd century. But for the legionnaire it was simply an endless cycle of swearing oaths to one man only to be ordered to fight him months later when another claimant rose. The sacred bond of the sacramentum still existed, but it had been hollowed, no longer anchored to enduring stability. The external threats they faced, however, revealed that despite political chaos, the Roman soldiers' skills remained formidable. On the Danube, legions confronted waves of Germanic incursions, often outnumbered yet capable of holding fortified lines, launching counterattacks, and protecting settlements. In the east, though Rome suffered defeats against the Sassanids, its soldiers continued to man fortresses, rebuild after setbacks, and resist further incursions. Even in the midst of crisis, the Roman military system proved resilient, capable of adaptation. Yet the cost was immense, for casualties mounted, provinces were devastated, and morale was strained. The economic turmoil of the century compounded these difficulties. Inflation eroded the value of pay as emperors debased coinage to fund endless wars. Soldiers found their wages buying less, their families struggling, and their rewards uncertain. The promise of land grants or pensions seemed remote when emperors did not reign long enough to honour them. As a result, legionaries relied more heavily on immediate plunder or donatives offered by new emperors seeking their loyalty. This further tied soldiers to individuals rather than to the empire, for the practical survival of the legionnaire and his family depended on the generosity of his commander in the moment, not on institutions that had once guaranteed stability. Frontier life during this period became harsher still. Forts were attacked more frequently, raids penetrated deeper, and entire provinces were sometimes lost temporarily. In Gaul and Britain, local commanders even broke away from Rome, forming the so-called Gallic Empire that lasted for over a decade. In the east, Palmyra, under Queen Zenobia, declared independence, fielding armies that included Roman-trained troops against the empire itself. Legionaries stationed in these regions sometimes found themselves forced into choosing between loyalty to Rome and survival under local leaders who promised protection. The fragmentation of the empire mirrored the fragmentation of soldierly allegiance, further eroding the cohesion that had once defined the legions. Yet the adaptability of the Roman soldier shone through even in this time of crisis. Units became more mobile, learning to respond quickly to raids and to fight in smaller detachments, rather than relying solely on massive set-piece battles. Cavalry gained greater importance, integrated more closely with infantry to counter the mobility of Germanic and Persian opponents. Fortifications were expanded and reinforced, turning frontier zones into militarized regions bristling with strongpoints. Soldiers became accustomed to constructing and manning these defences, spending as much time in sieges and raids as in open battle. The legionary system, once oriented toward large-scale campaigns of conquest, shifted toward defensive endurance, a transformation driven by the realities of the 3rd century. The capture of Valerian by Shapur was a humiliation that struck deeply into the hearts of the legions. To see an emperor paraded as a prisoner was a blow to Roman pride and a reminder of vulnerability. Yet the soldiers did not collapse in despair. Under new leaders such as Gallienus and later Aurelian, they rallied, regaining lost ground and restoring provinces. Gallienus reformed the army, creating a mobile cavalry reserve that could move swiftly to counter threats, while Aurelian led campaigns that reunited the fragmented empire, defeating both the Gallic Empire in the west and Zenobia's Palmyrene Empire in the east. Legionaries followed these leaders with renewed vigour, proving that even in crisis, their resilience remained. For the ordinary soldier, however, the strain was relentless. He endured rapid redeployments, poor pay, and constant danger. He saw comrades fall not only in battle but to disease and exhaustion. He swore oaths to emperors whose reigns lasted scarcely longer than a campaign season. He marched across provinces devastated by raids, encountering burned villages, displaced populations, and endless reminders that Rome's supremacy was no longer unquestioned. His service was a life of endurance without the certainty of reward, yet his discipline and cohesion ensured that the empire did not collapse entirely. The crisis also altered the social fabric of the army. Increasingly, recruits came from the provinces rather than Italy, for the manpower of the heartland had long been depleted. Gauls, Germans, Illyrians, and others filled the ranks, their loyalty tied less to Rome as an idea than to the comradeship of the legion and the authority of their immediate commanders. Many of the emperors who rose in this period came from military backgrounds in the provinces, especially from the Danubian region, where hardened soldiers produced leaders accustomed to crisis. The army became both the source of rulers and the instrument that made or unmade them. Religion, too, shifted during this turbulent century. Traditional rituals continued, but new cults, particularly that of Mithras, grew in popularity among soldiers. Its emphasis on loyalty, endurance, and brotherhood spoke directly to men who lived in constant danger. Temples to Mithras were built in frontier forts, where initiates gathered in underground chambers to perform rituals that reinforced their solidarity. As the empire faced fragmentation, these bonds provided a spiritual anchor for soldiers who saw the world around them crumbling. Later, Christianity also began to spread quietly within the ranks, though it was not yet the dominant faith. The legionary, seeking meaning in a time of chaos, turned to religion as much as to discipline to sustain his spirit. By the end of the 3rd century, the empire had begun to recover under leaders such as Diocletian, who restructured administration and stabilized frontiers. Yet the memory of crisis lingered. For the legionary, the experience of these decades was one of relentless strain, constant adaptation, and survival against overwhelming odds. He had fought enemies from every direction, faced economic ruin, and endured the chaos of rapid imperial succession. His loyalty had been tested again and again, and though often redirected toward individuals rather than institutions, it had nonetheless kept the empire alive. Without the endurance of these soldiers, Rome would have collapsed in the face of its many enemies. The crisis of the 3rd century thus stands as a testament to the resilience of the legionnaire. Though battered and strained, he remained disciplined, adaptable, and loyal enough to ensure that Rome endured. His life was harder than that of his predecessors, his rewards less certain, and his loyalty more conflicted. Yet he bore the weight of the empire in its darkest hour. The legions of this century were no longer the armies of conquest that had marched with Caesar or Trajan, but they were still Rome's shield, absorbing blows that might have shattered lesser states. Their endurance allowed Rome to emerge from crisis and continue for another century, even as the strains they bore left marks that would never fully fade. The early 4th century brought to the legions a transformation unlike any they had experienced before, for it was in this age that the rise of Constantine altered not only the structure of the empire, but the very spiritual foundations of the army itself. The soldier who once swore his oath by the gods of Rome, who offered sacrifice before the eagle, and who honoured Jupiter and Mars as the divine patrons of war, began to find himself in a world where a new religion was reshaping imperial authority. The Christianization of the army was not an overnight change, nor was it without tension, but it marked a profound shift in the culture of the legions, binding military service to a faith that would one day define the empire more strongly than any standard or banner of the past. Constantine's rise to power came at a moment when the empire was still reeling from the strains of the previous century. The reforms of Diocletian had stabilized administration and created the tetrarchy, a system of multiple emperors meant to prevent the chaos of endless civil wars. Yet this very system soon produced rivalries, and Constantine emerged as one of the strongest claimants. The army was central to his ascent, for it was the loyalty of the soldiers that made and unmade emperors in this era. Constantine's career revealed the continuing power of the legionary oath, but also the way in which religion was becoming entwined with military service in new ways. The turning point came before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE, where Constantine faced Maxentius near Rome. Ancient sources recount that Constantine, on the eve of battle, saw a vision in the sky, a cross of light, accompanied by the words promising victory in this sign. Whether this vision was literal, symbolic, or later embellished, it became the foundation of Constantine's association with Christianity. He ordered his soldiers to mark their shields with a Chi-Rho, the monogram of Christ, and marched into battle bearing a new emblem of faith. When he emerged victorious, overthrowing Maxentius and claiming control of the Western Empire, the role of Christianity in his triumph became inseparable from the memory of the event. For the legionaries who fought that day, the appearance of a new symbol on their shields marked the beginning of a profound transformation, one that redefined the meaning of their service. In the years that followed, Constantine extended his patronage of Christianity, issuing the Edict of Milan in 313 CE, which granted toleration to Christians throughout the empire. For soldiers, this meant that a faith once persecuted was now recognized, its adherents no longer forced to hide their worship. Within the camps and forts of the empire, soldiers who had already quietly practiced Christianity found themselves free to profess their belief openly. The legionary who once might have hidden his faith from his centurion now found the emperor himself honouring the God of the Christians. This shift altered the atmosphere of the army, introducing new rituals, prayers and identities alongside the older traditions. Yet the Christianization of the army was not a sudden replacement of one faith with another. Roman religion had always been pluralistic, and in the early 4th century soldiers still worshipped a wide range of gods, from Jupiter and Mars to Mithras and Sol Invictus. Mithraism in particular had deep roots in the army, with its rituals of brotherhood and secrecy appealing strongly to soldiers. Many legionaries still gathered in Mithraea, performing initiations and sharing sacred meals. But over time, as Constantine's support for Christianity grew, so too did the presence of Christian worship in military life. Chapels began to appear near forts, bishops visited soldiers, and Christian symbols were displayed alongside and eventually above older emblems. The transformation was not without conflict. Some soldiers resisted abandoning traditional rites, and tensions arose between those loyal to the old gods and those devoted to the new faith. Rituals that once unified the army, sacrifices before the standards, offerings to Mars, prayers to Jupiter, lost some of their universal force as Christianity grew. For centuries the sacramentum, the oath of loyalty, had been sworn in the name of the gods of Rome. Now it began to shift toward an oath taken before the God of the Christians and the emperor who claimed his protection. This change reflected not only a new faith, but also a new conception of authority, one that bound soldierly loyalty to a divine figure unlike the many deities of Rome's past. The campaigns of Constantine reinforced this transformation. His wars against rivals such as Licinius were fought under Christian banners, with soldiers carrying the labarum, a standard marked by the Chiro as a sacred emblem. This standard, held with reverence by the troops, replaced in part the older symbols of the legion, investing Christian imagery with the same sacred aura once reserved for the eagle. The legionary came to see his battles not merely as contests of men, but as struggles fought under the protection of a single god who ensured victory. The victories of Constantine reinforced this belief, for each triumph confirmed the power of the Christian god in the minds of soldiers. At the same time, Constantine did not entirely abandon traditional Roman religious language. He still invoked Sol, the unconquered sun, and he tolerated a wide range of practices. The gradual nature of the shift ensured that soldiers accustomed to older rituals could still find meaning, even as new symbols and ceremonies were introduced. The Christianization of the army was thus a process of integration rather than sudden rupture, blending older traditions with new practices until the latter predominated. Soldiers who once sacrificed bulls before Mars now found themselves attending Christian liturgies, yet both were seen, at least in the early years, as forms of seeking divine favour for the emperor and the army. The presence of Christian chaplains and bishops in military context grew over the course of Constantine's reign. Soldiers began to be baptized, prayers were offered for the emperor in Christian rites, and churches were constructed near major bases. The army became not only a defender of the empire but also a carrier of the new faith, spreading it along the frontiers and into the provinces where troops were stationed. The conversion of Constantine himself, whether complete during his reign or finalized at his death, gave the final seal of legitimacy to Christianity in the eyes of the soldiers. To serve Rome now meant to serve under a god who claimed universal dominion, just as the empire itself claimed universal rule. For the legionary, the shift meant new ways of understanding his duty and his life. No longer did he fight simply for Rome and emperor, he now fought under a divine protector whose authority transcended even the empire. The hardships of the march, the dangers of battle, the losses of comrades, all could be framed within a faith that promised eternal reward beyond the struggles of this world. The Christian promise of salvation resonated deeply with men who lived under the constant shadow of death, offering meaning to lives cut short and hope beyond the grave. In this way, Christianity provided not only a new spiritual foundation, but also a new psychological support for soldiers enduring the burdens of frontier service. The Christianization of the army also had political consequences. It bound the soldiers more closely to Constantine, for he was seen not only as their commander, but as God's chosen ruler. His victories were interpreted as divine favour, and his authority was sanctified in ways no emperor before him had claimed. This gave new force to the loyalty of the troops, anchoring their obedience not only in discipline and oath, but in belief that they served under a ruler favoured by heaven. Later emperors would continue to cultivate this bond, using Christian ritual and imagery to secure the devotion of their armies. The transformation did not end with Constantine's reign. Over the following decades, as Christianity became more firmly established, the old pagan rituals of the army gradually disappeared. Sacrifices to the gods were abandoned, temples to Mithras and other deities fell into decline, and the Christian cross became the dominant emblem of military life. Soldiers carried relics, prayed before battle in Christian rites, and sought the blessing of bishops before campaigns. The legionary had become not only Rome's defender, but also a soldier of Christ, his identity reshaped by a faith that would define the late empire. For those who had lived through the change, the difference was profound. Older veterans remembered the days when offerings were made to Mars and Jupiter, when the eagle was the holiest symbol in camp. Younger recruits grew up in a world where the cross was already familiar, where chapels stood beside barracks, and where the emperor himself built churches in the capital. The shift was generational as much as imperial, reflecting the broader transformation of the empire itself. In the ranks of the legions, as in the streets of Rome, the old gods faded into memory while the new faith rose in prominence. The Christianization of the army under Constantine was not merely a religious change, it was a redefinition of what it meant to be a Roman soldier. The legionary was no longer bound solely by the traditions of his ancestors, but by a universal faith that promised eternal victory. His battles were sanctified as holy struggles. His loyalty to the emperor fused with loyalty to God, his hardships given meaning by a hope that transcended the empire itself. The shift altered his daily life, his rituals, his oaths, and his sense of identity. It reshaped the culture of the legions and set the course for centuries of Christian empire that followed. The empire that had once been unified under Augustus and consolidated under successive rulers entered the later centuries of its existence in a new form, divided between East and West, and this division transformed the life of the legions as profoundly as any battlefield campaign. The split was not merely an administrative convenience but a fundamental reorganization of power, resources, and military structures. For the soldier, it meant new chains of command, new patterns of deployment, and an evolving identity that was tied not to a single empire but to the region in which he served. The division reflected both the strains of maintaining so vast a territory and the adaptability of Rome's military system in reshaping itself to endure changing circumstances. The initial seeds of division were planted in the reforms of Diocletian at the end of the 3rd century. Recognizing that no single ruler could effectively manage crises erupting simultaneously along the Rhine, the Danube, the Euphrates, and the deserts of Africa, he instituted the Tetrarchy, a system of 2 senior emperors, the Augusti, and 2 junior emperors, the Caesars. Each ruled a portion of the empire with their own courts, administrations, and armies. For the legionary, this meant that the emperor who held his loyalty was not necessarily the emperor of the entire Roman world, but the ruler responsible for his own frontier. The oath of service, once to a single sovereign in Rome, became localized, binding soldiers to emperors whose power was regional. Though the Tetrarchy eventually dissolved in conflict, the principle it embodied endured. The empire became accustomed to being ruled from multiple centres, with armies stationed under the authority of regional rulers. Constantine reunited the empire under his rule, but after his death it was once again divided among his sons, and the pattern of division and reunification repeated throughout the 4th century. Finally, in 395 CE, upon the death of Theodosius I, the empire was permanently split into eastern and western halves, each with its own emperor. From that point forward, the legions were no longer part of a single unified system, but served either the Eastern Roman Empire, governed from Constantinople, or the Western Roman Empire, governed from Milan, Ravenna, or Rome. For the soldier stationed in the east, this meant service in provinces such as Thrace, Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt, where he guarded against the Sassanid Persians, defended the Danube frontier, and maintained control over the wealthiest lands of the empire. For the soldier in the west, service meant defending Gaul, Italy, Britain, Spain, and North Africa, territories threatened by Germanic invasions, internal revolts, and later by the growing pressure of migrating peoples who pushed against Roman borders. Though they shared the same traditions, training, and identity, the soldiers of East and West gradually found themselves living in different worlds, their loyalties tied to separate emperors, their campaigns shaped by different enemies. The division also reshaped military structures in fundamental ways. The legions, once large units of around 5,000 men stationed in permanent bases, were reorganised into smaller, more flexible units. By the 4th century, the army was divided into two major categories: the comitatenses and the limitanei. The comitatenses were mobile field armies, designed to move quickly to confront threats wherever they arose. They were stationed near imperial courts, ready to march under the emperor's direct command. The limitanei, by contrast, were frontier troops stationed permanently along the borders, in forts, watchtowers, and fortified towns. They acted as the first line of defence against raids and incursions, holding enemies until the comitatenses could arrive. For the legionary, this meant a change in lifestyle depending on his assignment. Those in the limitanei lived much like earlier frontier soldiers, garrisoning forts, patrolling rivers, and maintaining defences. Their lives were tied to the land, and many settled locally, farming when not on duty, marrying into provincial communities, and becoming part of the frontier society. The comitatenses, on the other hand, lived lives of constant movement, following the emperor or his generals, marching swiftly across provinces, and engaging in major battles. They were the elite of the army, better equipped and better paid, their service reflecting the increasing need for mobility in an empire under constant pressure. This division of forces reflected the realities of the 4th and 5th centuries. No longer could the legions rely on the static defence of vast borders, for enemies were too numerous and too mobile. Instead, Rome needed a flexible system, one that could absorb the shock of raids on the frontier while concentrating power in mobile armies that could strike decisively. The legionary identity shifted accordingly. The image of the soldier living for decades in a single fortress was replaced by the soldier marching constantly with imperial armies or farming the frontier lands where he was stationed. The uniformity of the old legionary system gave way to diversity, with units of varying sizes, equipment, and traditions serving under the broad umbrella of the Roman military. The division of East and West also highlighted the differing fortunes of the two halves of the empire. In the East, wealthier provinces and stronger urban centres provided resources to maintain armies, fortify cities, and sustain long-term defence. Soldiers stationed in Constantinople, Antioch, or Alexandria lived in provinces that remained prosperous, their service tied to regions capable of supporting them with supplies, taxes, and infrastructure. In the West, however, economic decline weakened the army's foundations. Provinces such as Britain and Gaul suffered repeated invasions, agriculture and trade faltered, and resources to pay and supply soldiers became scarce. Legionaries in the West often endured irregular pay, shortages of equipment, and increasing reliance on plunder or the support of local elites. The changing nature of recruitment also reflected the pressures of the divided empire. Increasingly, soldiers were drawn not from Italy, whose population had long since ceased to be the main source of manpower, but from the provinces. Gauls, Thracians, Illyrians, Syrians, and Egyptians filled the ranks. their loyalties tied as much to their local communities as to the empire at large. In the west, as Germanic tribes pressed harder against the borders, Rome began to recruit foederati, allied troops drawn from these very tribes. These warriors fought alongside the legions, sometimes under their own leaders, sometimes integrated into Roman units. For the legionary, this meant serving beside men who only recently had been enemies, a reality that reflected the shifting balance of power. The role of cavalry grew in importance during this period, further changing the structure of the army, where once the heavy infantry of the legion had been the decisive arm of Rome's power. Now cavalry units became essential for rapid response, pursuit, and manoeuvre against mobile foes. Cataphract cavalry, modelled in part on Persian traditions, appeared in Roman armies, armoured heavily and capable of shock charges. Light cavalry drawn from allied peoples provided scouting and raiding capabilities. Infantry remained the backbone, but the soldier's world now included a far greater reliance on mounted comrades, altering tactics and the composition of armies. For the legionary himself, the division of the empire was experienced not as an abstract political fact, but as the reality of his service. A soldier stationed in the east might spend his career defending the Danube or fighting Persians, loyal to emperors in Constantinople, and sustained by the wealth of the eastern provinces. A soldier in the west might march repeatedly across Gaul, Italy, or North Africa, fighting Germans, Vandals, or Huns, loyal to emperors who often lacked resources to maintain their armies. Both shared the same traditions, but their experiences diverged, shaped by the fortunes of their respective halves of the empire. Religion also continued to shape the army during this period. With Christianity now firmly established, soldiers swore their oaths not only to their emperor, but before the God of the Christians. Chaplains accompanied armies. Churches were built in garrisons, and bishops played roles in legitimizing campaigns. The division of East and West did not divide the faith, but differences in practice and theology began to emerge, foreshadowing later schisms. For the soldier, however, the presence of Christian ritual in daily life reinforced a sense of divine protection, a source of strength amid the turbulence of war and uncertainty. The shifting military structures also reflected a new balance between soldier and civilian life. Limiternae, settled along frontiers, became almost a military peasantry, farming to support themselves and defending their regions when called. Comitatenses, by contrast, remained more detached, living lives of constant readiness, moving with the emperor and often fighting in large campaigns. This dual system ensured survival, but altered the character of military service. The unity and uniformity of the early imperial legions gave way to a patchwork of roles, statuses and traditions, reflecting the complexity of a divided empire. The division of East and West and the accompanying changes in military structures reveal the adaptability of the Roman system, but also the strains it faced. For the legionary, life was no longer defined by the certainties of Augustus's professional army or the great campaigns of Trajan. Instead, it was shaped by constant movement, shifting loyalties, diverse comrades, and the challenges of serving in an empire that was no longer unified. His identity remained rooted in discipline and tradition, but his daily life was transformed by the realities of a world where Rome itself had split in two, and where his service was shaped as much by regional circumstances as by the broader legacy of the empire. The soldiers of the late Western Empire lived through a time of mounting pressure, fragmentation, and transformation that slowly dismantled the structures their ancestors had once known. Where earlier generations of legionaries had marched beneath eagles into distant lands to expand Rome's dominion, the soldiers of the 4th and 5th centuries stood guard over an empire that was shrinking, beset by enemies on all sides and weakened by its own internal struggles. Their roles shifted from conquerors to defenders, and eventually to participants in the very processes that reshaped the Western world into something new. The fall of the Western Empire was not a sudden collapse but a long unravelling, and throughout that unravelling the legionnaire adapted, endured and transformed, until his identity no longer matched the figure who had once marched under Caesar or Augustus. The pressures on the Western Empire came from multiple directions. Germanic peoples, long settled along the frontiers of the Rhine and Danube, grew increasingly bold as Roman power weakened. The Goths, Vandals, Franks, Burgundians and Suebi pressed across borders, sometimes as raiders, sometimes as entire migrating communities seeking land and security within imperial territory. The arrival of the Huns in Europe in the late 4th century intensified these pressures, for their devastating raids forced many Germanic tribes to move westward, pushing into Roman lands in massive waves of migration. The legions stationed along the frontiers, already stretched thin by decades of resource shortages and political instability, struggled to contain these movements. Battles were fought, forts manned, raids repelled, but the sheer scale of migration was unlike anything Rome had faced before. The defeat at Adrianople in 378 CE marked a turning point. The Gothic victory over the Eastern Roman Emperor Valens revealed that Roman armies were no longer invincible. At Adrianople, heavy infantry formations, once the decisive arm of the legions, were overwhelmed by Gothic cavalry and resilient foot soldiers. The destruction of much of the Roman field army in the east reverberated through the west as well, signalling that the old methods of warfare were no longer sufficient. For the legionary, Adrianople was a reminder that discipline alone could not guarantee victory in a world where enemies had adapted, grown in strength, and mastered new tactics. In the west, emperors struggled to maintain authority as generals and warlords gained power. The chain of command became fractured, and soldiers often looked not to distant emperors, but to their immediate commanders for leadership. The loyalty of the legion shifted, as it had in earlier centuries, but now with greater permanence, for many units began to attach themselves to regional leaders who could provide pay, food, and protection. The authority of the Western emperors in Ravenna or Rome grew weaker, their dependence on generals such as Stilicho, Aetius, and Ricimer, revealing that true power often lay in the hands of men who commanded the loyalty of soldiers more directly than the emperors themselves. The economic difficulties of the West also reshaped the soldier's life. The resources available to maintain armies dwindled as provinces were lost, trade routes disrupted, and agricultural production declined. Soldiers were often paid irregularly, and some were granted land instead of wages, transforming them into semi-settled warrior farmers. The once clear distinction between the legionary as professional soldier and the peasant as farmer blurred, especially among the Limiteni who defended frontiers while supporting themselves through agriculture. This transformation reflected the empire's weakening ability to sustain large professional armies, forcing soldiers to adapt their identities to new realities. As central authority weakened, the recruitment of barbarian federati became increasingly common. Entire groups of Goths, Franks, Burgundians, and later even Huns were settled within the empire and enlisted to fight under Roman banners. These federate troops fought alongside traditional legionaries, sometimes loyally, sometimes with divided interests. For the Roman soldier, this meant serving beside men who had once been enemies, now allies in name but often pursuing their own goals. The integration of federati changed the character of the Roman army, reducing its cohesion and blurring the line between Roman and barbarian. The legionary of this age was no longer the inheritor of a purely Roman tradition, but part of a mixed force where identity was fluid and boundaries shifting. Campaigns of the 5th century reflected these new realities. In Gaul, Roman armies fought not to expand, but to hold against Visigoths, Burgundians and Franks, often relying on alliances with one group to check the power of another. In Hispania, Suebi, Vandals and Visigoths carved out kingdoms, while Roman soldiers attempted to defend cities and protect routes with diminishing resources. In North Africa, the Vandal conquest of Carthage in 439 CE dealt a devastating blow, depriving Rome of its richest grain supply and weakening the Western Empire's ability to feed its population and armies. Soldiers stationed in Africa were either absorbed into Vandal forces or abandoned as the province was lost, their lives uprooted in a process that revealed how fragile Rome's grip had become. The Hunnic invasions of the mid-5th century brought further strain. Under Attila, the Huns swept into Gaul and Italy, devastating towns and demanding tribute. Roman armies, often composed of federate troops, fought alongside remnants of the traditional legions to check their advance. The Battle of the Catalaunian Plains in 451 CE, where Roman forces under Aetius combined with Visigothic allies to defeat Attila, was one of the last great victories of Roman arms in the West. Legionaries who fought in that battle stood shoulder to shoulder with men who had once been their foes, united briefly by necessity. The victory revealed that Roman military traditions still held power when combined with strategic alliances, but it also underscored that Rome could no longer fight alone. The eventual deposition of the last Western emperor Romulus Augustulus in 476 CE by the Germanic leader Odoacer symbolized the end of imperial rule in the West. Yet for the soldiers who lived through this moment, the transition may not have seemed as dramatic as it appeared to later historians. Many legionaries had already been serving under barbarian commanders or alongside federate allies. The disappearance of the Western emperor changed the official hierarchy, but in practice soldiers continued to serve under leaders who provided for them. The transformation of the Roman army into the forces of the merging kingdoms was gradual, a process in which the legionary identity blended into that of the warrior elites of post-Roman Europe. The transformation of the legionnaire in this age was thus both material and cultural. His equipment had already changed, with long swords replacing the short gladius, heavier armour giving way to more flexible gear, and cavalry gaining prominence. His organisation had shifted from the large legions of earlier centuries to smaller units, comitatenses and federati, that reflected the realities of constant crisis. His rituals had altered, with Christian prayers and blessings replacing sacrifices to the old gods. His loyalty was no longer to a unified empire but to local commanders, regional powers, or even new kings who rose in the vacuum of imperial decline. Yet through all these changes he remained a soldier, defined by discipline, endurance, and the bonds of comradeship forged in hardship. The fall of the Western Empire was not the disappearance of the soldier, but his transformation into a figure who would shape the medieval world. The federate Goths, who fought under Roman banners, became the warriors of the Visigothic kingdom in Spain and Gaul. The Franks, who once served as auxiliaries and allies, became the founders of a new dynasty in northern Gaul. The Vandals, who seized North Africa, built a naval power that challenged the remnants of Roman control in the Mediterranean. In each case, Roman military traditions, techniques, and even terminology persisted, carried forward by men who had once called themselves legionaries. For the individual soldier, this transformation meant adaptation to a new identity. He might once have thought of himself as a Roman, sworn to defend the empire that stretched across the world. By the late 5th century, he might think of himself instead as a follower of a local warlord, a protector of his own community, or a warrior in the service of a new king who still drew upon Roman prestige while ruling independently. The continuity of military culture ensured that the skills of the legionary did not vanish, but were reshaped into the fabric of medieval Europe. Roads, forts, tactics, and discipline survived, but under new banners and in new forms. The fall of the Western Empire and the transformation of the legionnaire reveal that decline does not always mean disappearance. The soldier who once built camps on the Rhine, marched into Gaul, or manned Hadrian's Wall did not vanish when the emperor in Ravenna was deposed. He lived on in the armies of Goths, Franks, Burgundians, and others, his traditions preserved even as his allegiance shifted. The Western Empire as a political entity collapsed, but the legionary as a cultural figure endured, transformed into the warrior of the early medieval kingdoms. His adaptability was his legacy, ensuring that the spirit of Rome's military did not die with the empire, but continued to shape Europe in the centuries that followed. The memory of the Roman soldier did not vanish with the political disappearance of the Western Empire, but lingered through the centuries that followed, shaping the imagination, institutions and identities of the medieval world. Though the legions themselves were no longer mustered in the old forms, their image endured in chronicles, in law codes, in the architecture of forts and roads, and in the traditions carried forward by successor states. The Roman soldier, remembered as disciplined, organised, and invincible in his prime, became a figure that medieval societies looked back to with admiration, fear, and sometimes longing. His legacy was transmitted not only through the continuity of military practices, but also through the stories and myths that surrounded him, transforming him into a symbol of a lost age of order and power. The kingdoms that emerged in the ruins of the Western Empire inherited both the material and cultural remnants of the legions. Roads built by Roman soldiers still stretched across Europe, binding together regions that had once been provinces of the empire. Castles and fortresses often rose on the sites of Roman camps, their layouts shaped by the same principles of defence and order. Many of the barbarian kings who took control in Gaul, Spain or Italy presented themselves as heirs of Roman authority, and their warriors adopted aspects of Roman military identity to bolster their legitimacy. The Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Franks and Lombards all ruled in lands still marked by Roman traditions, and their armies absorbed Roman methods even as they adapted them to new circumstances. Law codes and chronicles preserved the image of the Roman soldier as a model of discipline and authority. The Theodosian Code and later the Justinian Code included provisions that reflected the organisation of the military, and these texts continued to influence medieval rulers. Clerics and chroniclers writing in Latin often drew upon Roman history to frame contemporary events, recalling Caesar's campaigns or Trajan's conquests as examples of leadership. The image of the legionary persisted as a figure of comparison, representing a standard of order against which the tumult of the medieval world could be measured. Soldiers of the Carolingian Empire, for example, marched on roads still maintained in part from Roman construction, and fought under kings who saw themselves as new emperors, protectors of Christendom but also heirs to the authority of Rome. The Eastern Roman Empire, known later as Byzantium, preserved the memory of the legionary more directly, for its armies evolved out of the Roman military system and maintained continuity in language, structure and identity. Byzantine soldiers still called themselves Roman, and their empire regarded itself as the continuation of Rome. Though their armies adapted, developing new forms of cavalry and thematic organisation, the heritage of the legion was never forgotten. Manuals of military strategy, such as those written by Maurice in the 6th century, drew upon Roman traditions even as they integrated new influences. To the Byzantines, the memory of the Roman soldier was not distant history but living tradition, and their pride in being Roman was inseparable from their sense of military inheritance. In the West, where continuity was more fractured, the memory of the Roman soldier took on a more legendary quality. Monks copying manuscripts preserved the works of authors such as Livy, Tacitus and Vegetius, whose descriptions of Roman military discipline provided models for later generations. Vegetius's De Re Militari, written in the late 4th or early 5th century, became especially influential, serving as a manual of military wisdom throughout the Middle Ages. Its emphasis on training, discipline and organisation was read by kings and generals who sought to restore order to their own armies. Though the legions themselves no longer marched, their practices lived on in texts that were studied, adapted and applied in new contexts. The image of the Roman soldier also entered the realm of myth. In medieval chronicles, Roman armies were often described with awe, their victories magnified, their discipline idealized. For peoples who lived in lands once conquered by Rome, the memory of legionaries was tied to stories of conquest and subjugation. In Britain, legends of Roman walls and roads mingled with tales of ancient heroes, shaping the Arthurian traditions that grew in the early medieval period. Roman ruins, still visible in towns and countryside, were interpreted as the works of giants or legendary kings, their true builders half forgotten, but always associated with immense power. The sight of a crumbling aqueduct or fortress reminded medieval observers that a great army had once ruled the land, and the figure of the soldier became part of the mythic past. Christian writers also reshaped the memory of the Roman soldier, framing him within the moral and spiritual narratives of the Church. Martyrs who had once served as legionaries, such as St. George or the Theban Legion, became celebrated figures, their military service intertwined with their witness to faith. The soldier's discipline and loyalty were reinterpreted as virtues of Christian devotion, transforming the legionary into a model of steadfastness not only in war but in faith. Hagiographies recast the Roman soldier as both warrior and saint, embedding his image into the spiritual imagination of medieval Europe. In this way, the memory of the legionary was not merely secular but also sacred, linking military service with divine purpose. The adaptation of Roman military practices into medieval contexts was not always direct, but often filtered through necessity. Fortified towns, a hallmark of Roman frontier defence, continued to serve as centres of power, their walls maintained or rebuilt by medieval rulers. The idea of standing armies, though largely abandoned in favour of feudal levies, still echoed Roman traditions, and some rulers sought to maintain permanent troops that recalled the professionalism of the legions. The Carolingian capitularies of Charlemagne, for example, reveal attempts to impose training and organisation reminiscent of Roman discipline, even if the feudal system limited the extent to which such ideals could be realised. The legionary thus remained a figure of aspiration, a reminder of what organised military power could achieve. For the common people of medieval Europe, the memory of the Roman soldier was often experienced through the ruins and roads that still shaped their lives. Farmers ploughed fields divided by old Roman roads, merchants travelled along routes once laid by legionaries, and villagers lived within walls originally raised by Roman garrisons. These tangible remnants preserved the soldier's presence even when his name was forgotten. The discipline of his camp, the stones he laid, and the fortresses he built became the foundations of medieval towns and cities. In this way, the Roman soldier remained a silent companion to medieval life, his works enduring long after his banners had disappeared. In art and iconography, the Roman soldier continued to appear as a symbol of authority and strength. Medieval manuscripts depicted him in armour, sometimes accurately, sometimes anachronistically, as a figure of martial virtue. Kings and knights were often compared to Roman generals, their victories cast as continuations of Roman glory. The Roman soldier thus became part of the symbolic language of power, invoked to legitimize rulers and inspire warriors. Even as the actual structures of Roman military organization faded, the image of the legionary endured as a standard against which medieval military life was measured. The transformation of the Roman soldier in memory was not uniform. In some contexts he was remembered as the conqueror, the oppressor, who had once subdued local peoples. In others he was remembered as the bringer of order, the builder of roads and cities. In Christian tradition he was remembered as the martyr or the saint, in scholarly tradition as the model of discipline, in popular legend as the figure of awe who built works too grand to be explained by ordinary men. This multiplicity of memories ensured that the figure of the Roman soldier remained alive, his image adaptable to the needs of each generation. By the later Middle Ages, as Europe entered new phases of consolidation, and kings sought to strengthen their armies, the Roman soldier again became a figure of study. Humanist scholars rediscovered classical texts, and the military manuals of antiquity were read with fresh interest. The Roman legionary, once a living figure in Europe's fields and cities, returned as an ideal of organisation and discipline, shaping the thought of those who sought to revive the power of centralised states. Even before the Renaissance fully revived classical traditions, the memory of the Roman soldier had already travelled through the medieval centuries, never entirely forgotten, always available as a model, myth, or moral. The medieval memory of the Roman soldier thus reveals the enduring power of the legionary identity. Though the empire that had once commanded his service fell in the west, and though the legions themselves dissolved, His presence lingered in roads, walls, texts, legends, and saints. He was remembered as conqueror, as martyr, as builder, as model, as myth. His discipline became a lesson for rulers, his faithfulness a lesson for Christians, his endurance a lesson for peoples who lived amid constant change. The Roman soldier, even in memory, continued to serve, shaping the medieval world as surely as he had once shaped the empire. The figure of the Roman legionnaire did not fade with the Middle Ages, but continued to inspire imagination into the modern era, taking on new meanings in each age that recalled, studied, or reinvented him. For scholars, artists, generals, and even common people, the legionary became both a historical subject and a symbol of enduring discipline, empire, and identity. His presence was invoked in political debates, military reforms, national mythologies, and cultural works, shaping how successive generations understood not only Rome, but also themselves in relation to its legacy. In modern times, the legionnaire has been remembered as both the archetype of the disciplined soldier and as a contested figure whose image could be adapted to support different ideologies. The rediscovery of classical texts during the Renaissance played a decisive role in reviving the memory of the legionnaire. Humanists who pored over manuscripts of Livy, Tacitus, and Polybius encountered detailed accounts of Roman campaigns, sieges, and tactics. Vegetius's De Re Militari, long copied through the medieval period, was now studied with renewed vigour, providing a blueprint of Roman discipline that many sought to imitate. Military leaders of early modern Europe admired the Roman system for its organisation, its reliance on strict training, and its integration of engineering into warfare. The legionary became a model for reformers who sought to professionalise armies in an age when mercenary forces often proved unreliable. The appeal of the Roman example lay in its combination of order and endurance, qualities seen as essential to the stability of states emerging from feudal fragmentation. The Enlightenment further entrenched the legionary as a figure of study and debate. Philosophers and historians saw in him the embodiment of civic virtue, a soldier who served not for plunder but for the state, whose loyalty and discipline preserved the Republic and then the Empire. Montesquieu and Gibbon, among others, wrote about the legions as central to Rome's rise and fall, using their history to reflect on the strengths and weaknesses of modern states. In Gibbon's monumental Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, the decline of military discipline and the transformation of legionaries into mercenary-like forces was presented as a central cause of Rome's collapse, a lesson for contemporary societies about the dangers of losing civic commitment. The legionary was thus cast as both example and warning, his memory shaping how thinkers understood the relationship between military power and political stability. In the age of nationalism and empire, the legionary was appropriated as a symbol of continuity and conquest. France, in particular, adopted Roman imagery to connect its imperial ambitions to the ancient past. Napoleon Bonaparte consciously evoked the legacy of Rome, comparing his armies to the legions and casting himself as new Caesar. His reforms of military organisation emphasised discipline, centralised command and mobility, qualities he admired in Roman history. Artists and propagandists of his era depicted French soldiers with Roman references, reinforcing the idea that the modern empire was heir to the ancient one. Across Europe, governments and armies studied Roman models as they sought to build disciplined forces capable of sustaining imperial ventures. The 19th century also saw the creation of new institutions explicitly inspired by the Roman soldier. The French Foreign Legion, established in 1831, deliberately invoked the legacy of Rome in its name and ethos. Composed of volunteers from many nations, hardened by training and discipline, it echoed the multinational character of Rome's armies and carried forward the image of the soldier who belonged to an institution larger than himself. The Foreign Legion's reputation for endurance in harsh conditions, loyalty to its core, and willingness to fight in distant lands drew directly upon the myth of the legionnaire, ensuring that the memory of the Roman soldier was not merely academic but also institutional. Archaeology added another dimension to the modern imagination of the legionnaire. Excavations of forts, camps, and battlefields across Europe and the Middle East uncovered tangible remains of military life. Inscriptions, weapons, armour, and everyday objects revealed details about how soldiers lived, fought, and died. Museums displayed legionary helmets, swords, and shields, turning the ancient soldier into a visible presence for modern audiences. The sight of these artifacts brought to life the descriptions found in texts, making the legionnaire not just a figure of history, but a material reality that people could study, touch, and envision. Reenactments and reconstructions in later centuries further revived the image as enthusiasts dressed in Roman armour and demonstrated tactics, bringing the discipline of the legion into public spectacle. The modern imagination of the legionnaire also entered popular culture. Literature and later film presented him as both heroic and brutal, a figure of fascination whose life embodied courage, loyalty, and the harsh realities of empire. Novels set in Roman times often place the legionary at their centre, portraying him as the common soldier whose perspective revealed the larger struggles of empire. In cinema, from early silent films to grand epics of the mid-20th century, the legionary became a recognisable icon, his armour and standards instantly evoking the grandeur and violence of Rome. These portrayals reached wide audiences, ensuring that the memory of the legionnaire was not confined to scholars or soldiers, but became part of mass culture. The symbolic power of the legionary extended beyond military contexts into political rhetoric. Statesmen invoked the example of Rome to legitimize authority, drawing parallels between modern nations and the empire of antiquity. Fascist Italy under Mussolini made particularly heavy use of Roman imagery, parading soldiers in uniforms reminiscent of legionaries, reviving standards and insignia, and presenting the regime as the rebirth of Roman glory. The legionary became a political symbol, appropriated to convey strength, discipline, and continuity with a mythical past. This appropriation revealed the enduring malleability of the figure, capable of serving different ideologies depending on the needs of those who invoked him. At the same time, modern scholarship complicated the image of the legionary. Historians uncovered the harsh realities of his life, the brutality of discipline, the heavy burden of service, and the violence inflicted upon conquered peoples. The legionary was no longer seen only as a paragon of order, but also as a participant in oppression, conquest, and exploitation. This duality entered modern imagination as well, making the Roman soldier a figure of both admiration and critique. In novels and films of the late 20th and 21st centuries, he could be portrayed as heroic, tragic, or even villainous, reflecting the complexities of Rome itself. The legacy of the legionary also lived on in the continuing study of military organisation. Modern armies, while technologically advanced, still drew lessons from Roman practices of discipline, training, and logistics. The emphasis on drilling, the importance of engineering, the role of supply lines, and the value of esprit de corps were all qualities associated with the legions and consciously adopted or studied by later militaries. The Roman soldier thus remained present in modern military academies, his example a reminder of how deeply ancient traditions continue to inform contemporary practice. For ordinary people, the legionary remained a figure of fascination, encountered in textbooks, museums, novels, films, and even video games. His armour and weapons became instantly recognisable symbols of Rome, his life a subject of curiosity about how soldiers once lived. Tourism to Roman sites brought millions to walk along the same roads, see the same walls, and imagine the soldiers who had once stood guard there. The memory of the legionary thus entered not only high culture and political ideology, but also popular imagination, ensuring that he remained part of the cultural consciousness across centuries. In modern imagination, the legionnaire serves as a mirror through which societies reflect on power, discipline, and identity. He is remembered as the disciplined soldier who enabled an empire to endure for centuries, but also as the instrument of conquest whose campaigns brought suffering and domination. He is admired for his resilience, his engineering skill and his loyalty, yet questioned for his role in maintaining imperial power. He is both symbol of order and a reminder of violence, both hero and oppressor. This complexity is what gives his legacy such enduring force, for each generation finds in him the qualities it wishes to see, whether to emulate, critique, or simply remember. The legionary in modern times is thus not merely a figure of the past, but a living presence in imagination and legacy. His discipline is studied by soldiers, his image appropriated by politicians, his life portrayed in art and media, his memory carried in roads, walls and ruins that still shape the landscapes of Europe and beyond. He endures not only as a soldier of Rome, but as a universal symbol of the human experience of war, loyalty and endurance. His transformation from ancient warrior to modern icon reveals the enduring power of Rome to shape the memory of the world, and through him, the empire continues to live in the imagination of all who remember it.